Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for waking up early. I know we've been asking a lot of you. Glad you're all having breakfast. As soon as everybody sits down, I'm going to invite A.G. Tong up here to introduce our morning welcome guest, who's the owner of this hotel. So everybody, settle in. Thanks.
All right, good morning, everybody. Everybody is refreshed, energized. I'm not. Last night I asked Bethany, what time are we starting tomorrow? And she said, how about 8? I said, how about 8:15? But let me just thank Bethany and the team at the State Impact Center. Kathy over there again, thank you, Kathy. The team here at the Hotel Marcel, the team last night at the Peabody. Thank you all for taking such good care of us. Oh, Bethany, your phone timed out. I'm reading off Bethany's phone. All right, there we go. So we have, it's been a real special treat to be in this hotel. And we have an extra special treat this morning. We have the owner and developer of this hotel, Bruce Becker, here with us this morning. Let me just give you a little background on Bruce. Bruce has a firm based in Westport, Connecticut, which is halfway between here and where I live in Stamford, not too far away. And he's president of Becker and Becker. And what Bruce does is he transforms these incredible spaces, and he focuses on developments that have transformative social and environmental value. So some of the projects he's undertaken was rehabilitation of a former Bank of America tower in Hartford into a 285-unit LEED Platinum mixed income community. He worked on 360 State Street and redeveloped that in New Haven, which was a long vacant urban site, into a 500-unit mixed income community and cooperative grocery store. The adaptive reuse of the Warrigan Hotel in Norwich, Connecticut, again, 70 units of affordable housing. And he also, for the New Yorkers here, restored the historic Octagon Tower on Roosevelt Island to create a 500-unit mixed income community and waterfront park. And he did this. And what this was, we were talking about last night, because if you live in Connecticut, you've driven by, on the way to IKEA, you've driven by this building a gazillion times. And before it was redeveloped, right, Matt, you wondered what the hell is going on in that building. For going on 20 years. It was a former Armstrong, right, and then Pirelli tire building. And so talk about it, all that we're talking about here, talk about a building that is a legacy building that was part of an economy that we're trying to move on from. And a legacy building that for a long time struggled to find a next chapter. And Bruce imagined a beautiful hotel here, but not just a beautiful hotel, but a net zero emission hotel that is a passive house, LEED passive. And I'm going to ask Bruce to explain that, but I know he's an expert on passive houses and is a member of a number of historic preservation and architectural organizations and societies, and also works on LEED certification and passive house standards. And so because of Bruce's vision, we have this incredible space, and I want to bring Bruce Becker up here and share his thoughts about how we got here. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Excellent. Fantastic. Well, what an honor to be here and to be part of what you're doing. I know you're talking about recycling plastic, but why not recycle the buildings that the plastics companies were headquartered in? So this building was designed originally in 1968 by Marcel Breuer, who was he actually taught at the Bauhaus, and then he taught a whole generation of architects at Harvard. His students were sort of a who's who of modern architecture, including Philip Johnson and Paul Rudolph and I.M. Pei. So he was sort of the leader of the modern movement in America. And so this was his most visible building. And as everyone's noted, it was sat here vacant for 20 years. As an architect and developer, we've learned that if you can recycle buildings, it's actually the process of building buildings that is the most carbon intensive. We now know how to operate buildings with basically no carbon emissions, although people are sort of slow to embrace that. But actually building the building is the most carbon intensive thing that happens. So if you can recycle a building, I mean, that is magical because you can eliminate the carbon impact of that. Otherwise, you have to build out of timber and carbon sequestering buildings, materials. So I'm just going to flip through some slides here to give you a little picture of what this building looked like. This is what it was in 1970 when it opened as the headquarters for Armstrong Rubber. It had a big wing in the back that was torn down by IKEA when they built their store and needed space for a parking lot. But the preservation community rallied around the building because it really is very significant in this mid-century modern chapter of architecture. It was Breuer's most visible building in the world because 40,000 cars a day passed by it and wondered, about it. The building was well documented. These are pictures from the Smithsonian Archive. So when I came to it, it had been vacant for 20 years and it sort of looked like this on the inside. So came up with a plan to remake it into a hotel and conference center. It's really sort of a mission-driven project. Like you guys are trying to solve all the big problems in the world as an architect and builder. The last thing I want to do is make the problems worse. So I've just committed to not only reuse the building in a way that it was productive with a 165-room hotel, preserve it from a historic preservation standpoint, and also become a part of a branded hotel chain with Hilton. But then we layered on a sustainability program to be LEED certified. Passive House certified is sort of this magical way to design a building so it's like a thermos, and it only uses about 20% of the energy of a typical code-compliant building. In Massachusetts, they've actually required all new apartment buildings to be Passive House certified because it's a way you can not have to increase the capacity of the grid and go to all-electric buildings. Most people think, we're going to have to invest billions of dollars in the electrical grid to have all-electric buildings. But in fact, if you design buildings this way, and you guys probably appreciated how quiet the rooms were, particularly those who were on the highway, you can't hear, you can hear a pin drop, and there might be tractor trailers rattling by. But anyhow, so we're the first all-electric building, the first Passive House certified hotel in America, and we're actually making most of our power on site. And we have a microgrid here, so we're sort of pushing power back into the grid when it needs it. There are a lot of things that we've done here that are first. We have commercial scale water source heat pumps, air source heat pumps to make domestic hot water. That hadn't been done before. That was sort of the, making hot water was the gateway drug for fossil fuel use in commercial buildings, but that's no longer needed. We have an all-electric kitchen, and if you guys have been enjoying the amazing food that Chef Megan and her team purvey, you can see that there's no compromise needed there with induction cooking. All these things I tried out myself at home first before rolling them out, but it really is a great, much better way to make great food. And then also we have an all-electric laundry with the first heat pump dryers, which is a huge savings, but allows us to reduce our energy use. We have 26 electric car chargers. We even have an electric shuttle van. So we've reduced our carbon emissions to zero. The hotel industry has made pledges to reduce, each of the brands to reduce their carbon emissions by as much as 65%. Although I think the little secret is they actually haven't, they're going in the other direction. So they may need some help from this group to be encouraged to do that. They'll actually appreciate it because when you're energy use goes down, your energy costs go down too. So even though it's a new thing, I think it's something that is actually more profitable. And we can get our carbon footprint to zero if we adopt these strategies that are reflected here. I've been giving presentations to architects and builders and hotel brands, and it's really exciting to have this example that the industry can follow to meet their goals. But my sense is, sort of like the plastics industry, they're not really focused on it, and they need a little bit of encouragement from you guys. Talked a little bit about Passive House, and if anyone's curious about it, I can go through. There are only 5 principles, but the result is you use 80% less energy, and it's super quiet and more comfortable than a regular building. You have to have thick windows, and you have to have heat recovery. This is also a building that has all DC infrastructure. All the lights are powered with Ethernet cables, and we save about 30% of our energy use by not having to transform from AC to DC. And you probably have had a fun time trying to figure out how to turn the lights on in your hotel rooms, but it gives you more control and more flexibility, more comfort. And so we can do all this and use half the energy of a typical building and be more comfortable. This is an interesting chart. The city of New York is probably at the forefront of monitoring energy use and carbon emissions for buildings, because they've been doing this for a while, and they require reporting. And hotels are typically the worst performing buildings, and they can be the best. So that's my presentation. You know, we have 1,000 solar panels. We have a microgrid that allows us to operate off-grid and be a resource. The building's been designated as a critical facility by the City of New Haven, so if there's a major regional outage, first responders can come here and have their operations here. So that is the show, and I'm so gratified you're here and enjoying this facility, because it's allowing us to further the mission of Hotel Marcel by multiplying our positive impact in the world.
Okay, the scientific briefing is going to get started. Hopefully y'all have your mics on. Come on up and we can get started.
All right, good morning, everyone. Feel free to grab those last tasty morsels and head on over to the table. My name is Leslie Shore, and I'm a full professor of chemical engineering at the University of Connecticut. I'm also the vice provost for graduate education and the dean of the graduate school. And I lead a project of 10 different researchers spanning the sciences and the engineering, policy, and practice on microplastics in the environment. And so we have this distinguished panel that I will be introducing as we go forward, but I thought it would be great, and the conveners invited me to give you a little taste for the research that's going on here in the great state of Connecticut, as well as hearing from the global and international perspectives. So our project focuses on microplastics. Microplastics are fragments of plastic that are about the size of a grain of rice. Next slide. And when people think about plastics in the ocean or the great ocean garbage patch, especially when students are trying to propose and defend their thesis, we get pictures that are great for the evening news, no offense to the news guys here. Pull at the heartstrings, the turtles, you know, oh my gosh. But the reality is that the ocean is a big thing, the world is a huge place, and plastics are very dilute. That's a good thing and a bad thing. If you sampled the Long Island Sound and had a cubic meter of water, which is about the size of this podium here in front of me, you might find 2 or 3 particles of plastic within that whole volume of water. The issue there, though, is that they're so dilute, it's hard to gather them together. It's hard to separate them out of the ocean. And it's hard for the microbes that can degrade many kinds of plastic to ever come in contact with that plastic in the first place and take care of it. Next slide. One of the other things about plastic that's important to know is naturally in the environment, plastic, which tends to be, by the way, fibers and films, not really spheres of plastic, are continuously breaking down. Exposure to light, UV light, causes them to become more brittle. The action of waves causes particles to mechanically break apart. And as the particles get smaller and smaller and smaller, the surface area of those particles increases. And so I'm sure one of the things you're going to be hearing a lot from the esteemed panel is the role of microplastics as being a vehicle for compounds that are dangerous to our health, including endocrine disrupting compounds and forever chemicals like PFAS. And so those particles are sticking to the plastic, and the more surface area there is, the more real estate there is, basically, to find a foothold and stick on that plastic. Next slide. What also is sticking to that plastic are microbes. And so we have here some scanning electron microscope photos of real plastic particles collected from the ocean. In panels A and B, you can see bacteria that are actually in a little trench, in a little valley, and that's a depression of their own making. So these bacteria are slowly breaking down, consuming, using the carbon in the plastic for energy and life of the microorganism. And that's a great thing. But again, with plastics being so dilute in the natural environment, it's unlikely that the microbe that can degrade the plastic and the plastic particle are ever going to find each other in this huge ocean. Next slide. So one of the cool things going on right up the road at UConn, come see us, great ice cream, is that our beautiful campus is kind of like its own little city. We're eagerly pursuing our own sustainable climate initiatives at UConn, and the whole campus is a living lab. And so we use our own power system, our water systems, our water reclamation systems as experimental test beds to try out new things. And so specifically in my project, we're using the water treatment plant because more than half of the microplastics in Connecticut surface waters originated from the treated effluent of a wastewater treatment plant. And the reason for that is that water treatment plants essentially operate on 1,000-year-old technology, and they were never developed for buoyant particles that float on water and can evade basically the physical separations that happen in a water treatment plant. Next slide. So we've been actually characterizing the plastics that are really in the water treatment plant, which is our own city of 30,000 people, students and staff. We find, you can see in the pie charts, the majority of those particles are going to be fibers and films. So think about that, the geometry is important. And most of them are biodegradable, but slowly biodegradable. And so we've modeled this whole plant. Next slide. And specifically, what we're doing is trying to take a page out of nature. And instead of just invent everything on our own, look around and say, okay, we've got these dilute particles in the environment. What in the real world is gathering together? And actually mussels, and I don't mean like these mussels, I mean like the delicious ones that you have with maybe a garlic sauce or marinara, are amazing water cleaning machines. And so a small mussel you could hold in your hand can filter 10 liters of water in 10 minutes with less energy than any type of filtration process. So what we're doing at the lab, next slide, is we're actually taking real mussels to concentrate together plastics with bacteria that break down plastic. And you can see in the pictures along the bottom, that is plastic particles in the, we'll say, processed food particles of mussels. And then in the microscope photo next to that, you can actually see bacteria attached to the plastic particles. And so what we're doing is we're avoiding that huge dilution problem we had at the beginning and bringing the degraders and the plastics together in a sustainable, low energy way that hopefully can be part of our future strategy. So we have a water treatment plant. And then the plan is we have a constructed wetland with mussels and also providing other ecosystem services that will collect all the plastics out of the effluent, gather them together, package them with bacteria that can degrade the plastic, and that's the way we go forward. So next slide. So just wanted to give that color for what's going on up the road a piece and thank my collaborators. And then we'll be moving on now to the talks of our esteemed panelists here today. So I believe the first talk is going to be from Jeff Keithline. Was that close? Awesome. Who is a partner at the law firm of Keller and Heckman. He represents companies throughout the packaging value chain, from raw material producers to finished packaging manufacturers and food companies, to assist in establishing the suitable regulatory status of packaging in the US and around the world. And he's going to be reviewing for us today how FDA regulates food packaging and food contact materials. Let's give Jeff a round of applause. Thank you.
So a few people have been talking about their connection to Connecticut when they have introduced themselves, and the first real job I had out of college was here in Eastern Connecticut at when I reported to the USS West Virginia as a submarine officer, and I saw the pictures of the water column, which is really kind of cool to see coming back to my roots. But yeah, I am a partner at Keller and Heckman. My understanding, I appreciate the State Impact Center inviting Keller and Heckman to speak today. I understand that the FDA was invited to attend, and they had other obligations and couldn't come to speak, so I'm here speaking about what FDA does to regulate food contact materials. I think first, before I jump into my first slide, I just want to, this is something that I think I haven't heard much today, but packaging, I think, gets a bad rap. I understand that the folks here have certain perspectives about packaging material, but I think it's also important to recognize some of the benefits that packaging brings to food. Primarily, it allows us to deliver food from where it's grown or processed to the consumers, and it protects that food during that shipping process. It prevents contamination, either bacteriological or chemical contamination from the handling of that through its life cycle, and also it plays a role in ensuring that food can be delivered to the consumers as they prefer to receive it. It provides information to the consumer about what's in that product, and then also how to process or use that food. So I think it often goes unspoken here in this room about some of the benefits that packaging brings. And just a side note to think about. Food waste is a large greenhouse gas emitter, and there are certain uses of packaging that will potentially reduce food waste. And I do think we need to think about that as well when we're thinking about the benefits of packaging material. Can I go to the next slide? So I'd like to talk about how FDA regulates food packaging material, and it's an important point to note that FDA regulates food contact materials, not just certain plastic materials, but all food contact materials, including food packaging. So food contact materials that are used in the processing of food or delivery of food, as well as the packaging, are all regulated. FDA regulates not just plastics; they regulate paper, metal, glass, all types of materials that are used in contact with food. But also it's important to note they regulate packaging material just like food ingredients, because their regulatory authority to clear food contact materials is derived under the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act and the definitions of food additives. Food additives has a very long definition, but if a substance is reasonably expected to become a component of food, it's considered a food additive, and FDA is required to clear that material under one of the several processes that they have prior to that material being used in contact with food. Historically, food contact materials have been cleared under the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act under 409 of the Act, which has allowed them to adopt regulations, and they established listings for those materials in the Code of Federal Regulations. I cited the regulations here, Part 175 through 179. There are also GRAS regulations and prior sanctions that are included in that document. It's interesting. I forgot to bring my prop, but the CFR that I use on a daily basis when advising clients is about that thick, and about 2/3 of that book relates to the cleared food contact materials. The other other third of that material is the actual direct food ingredients. So FDA has a number of regulations that apply to food contact materials. However, in about the mid-90s, FDA recognized with industry that the process that they used for clearing food contact materials was a bit broken. So they started working with industry to develop an alternative process. It's based on the TSCA pre-manufacturing notice process, the PMN process, and developed this food contact notification process. It was adopted in 1997 by Congress, but is typical, I've heard several times in the room, Congress is not really effectual. So it took them 3 years to actually appropriate money to run the program. And the program can't run unless FDA has money, and so it wasn't until 2000 when they got $6 million to run that program. Next slide. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how FDA regulates, or how food contact notification is put together. FDA's got several guidance documents to guide industry on how to prepare a food contact notification. Essentially, the manufacturer who wants to place that product on the market provides information to FDA about the characterization of the substance, what that substance is manufactured from, what the manufacturing process is, all the raw materials that are used to make that product, and then provide an impurity profile. With that information, the manufacturer follows FDA's guidance about how to estimate migration of those chemicals to food. So they simulate that by using food simulating solvents. FDA's got a list of solvents, and they have a very particular protocol, so depending on how that product is used, to estimate how much of those chemicals would migrate into food. And then they require the company to estimate the dietary exposure. Dietary exposure is then considered, you have to, as a manufacturer of a FCN, you have to estimate the cumulative dietary intake to those substances. So you don't just look at your substance and what it's introducing into the human diet, but you also need to look at the total exposure of that substance from other dietary sources. And so FDA maintains a database of CEDIs, the cumulative dietary intake, and you have to add your intake to that. Once you have the exposure number, then you compare it to the toxicity that's available in that substance. FDA has a tiered approach when looking at toxicity, which is outlined in their toxicity guidance. Again, at very low dietary exposures, FDA is primarily concerned about carcinogenicity or mutagenicity, and so there are screening tests for that FDA requires that companies do. As you increase the levels of exposure, FDA requires more and more toxicity. So if you're at a dietary exposure between a dietary concentration of greater than 50 parts per billion, FDA requires subchronic feeding studies. And then if you have a significant exposure, FDA requires chronic feeding studies. Even if you don't, if you have a very low dietary intake, FDA requires that you assess all available toxicity that exists, even if you're not required to generate your own toxicity. And then finally, there's an environmental assessment or a claim of categorical exclusion. Under the Federal Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, FDA's review of food contact notifications is a major federal action, and they're required to assess the environmental impact of those actions. And so most FCNs require an environmental assessment. There are some that have very low intake, and so there's a possibility that you can claim the categorical exclusion under FDA's guidance. Next slide. And then finally, what FDA does once they receive this information. So they have a set of groups of review chemists and review toxicologists that review all of this information. They have a very rigorous process to review this information. They do this in 2 phases. They have a first phase, phase 1 review, where they gather the information, make sure it's sufficient, it meets all their guidance. And then they proceed into phase 2 after they have reviewed that initial information. If they find that there are inefficiencies or deficiencies in the information that's submitted, they will submit a letter to the notifier and indicate that that material isn't adequate. They won't accept it for filing, and you have to continue to work on that. If you can't respond to FDA within a short amount of time, then you have to withdraw that notification and then work to complete that information. After they complete their review, FDA does issue a final letter. And again, as I mentioned before, the FDA's review is the same as it is for food ingredients. The standard of review is reasonable certainty of no harm, and that's outlined in the FDA's, in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act under 409C. They will issue a final letter to the notifier and then put that inventory on the public, on their public website. And just a note, FDA's review memos, as well as the non-confidential portions of those notifications, are available through Freedom of Information Act by submitting those requests to FDA. I thought it was also interesting just to note a little bit unique aspects about FCNs. They are proprietary clearances, and so Company A, who submits a notification for a food contact material, gets a clearance from FDA. But if their competitor, Company B, wants to also make that same substance for food contact substance for use in food contact applications, they have to go through that same process and get a notification as well from FDA. So it's not like the old days where regulation was universally applicable to anyone who could make that substance. This applies only to the manufacturer who submitted the notification and their downstream customers. And that FDA likes that because that gives them a few bites of the apple. So if they've reviewed a material and they receive a second FCN, they can do a new review of that material a second time. They have done that many times. They also have applied additional restrictions to substances. So substances that was cleared in the early days of the program may have some limits, but additional, the ones that have gone in more recently have additional limits that are applied to them. I think that's what I had to cover, so I'm happy to sit down and listen to the other panelists, so thank you.
All right, and I think we're going to hold questions till the end. So I'm going to bring Tracy Woodruff up next. She is a professor and director of the program on reproductive health and the environment and the Environmental Research and Translation for Health Center. She's a recognized expert on environmental pollution exposures and impacts on health, with a focus on pregnancy, infancy and childhood, health equity, and translating science into policy. And she comes to us from the University of California, San Francisco.
All right, good morning. You guys like marathon your meetings, you lawyers. I thought scientists were like into that, but apparently we're here. So I'm going to talk about science. And you probably haven't heard of UCSF because we don't have a mascot or a team or even undergraduates, but we have huge research funding. We are the top 10 medical clinical sciences training and #1 in NIH funding among public universities, Yale. Anyway, so I had to say that because California people. All right, so let's get started. I have no financial interest to declare. The Earth Center and PRE are dedicated to healthier environments. We conduct research to understand environmental toxic chemical exposures and how they influence those who are most susceptible: pregnancy, childhood, communities, low-income communities, and communities of color who are more impacted by toxic chemicals. And then we make that science actionable for decision makers in the clinical and policy arenas. So this talk is really going to review some work that we did with the California Science Policy Evidence Consortium. I put the references here. I'm going to just give you the take-home message. There is a lot of science. There is science to act. So that's my conclusion, my first conclusion. And you can read all about it in these very, well, okay, one of them is mine, so that is a bias. But one of them is a review that reviews high quality gold standard reviews, and the other one is a report that was led by the California Science Policy Evidence Consortium for the California legislature looking at microplastics, which was done 2 years ago. You know, so we're ahead of the curve a little bit here. And you've already heard that plastic production is increasing, so we have a big challenge ahead of us. Judith gave an excellent talk on this yesterday. And I'm going to talk about the other thing that is also increasing in the population, and that is the rate of chronic diseases. So I'm talking about things like metabolic disorders, diabetes, obesity, cancer. Now we're seeing more cancer in young people, neurodevelopmental disorders, neurodegenerative disorders. We have seen a dramatic shift in the health of the population from 1990, which is not that long ago, to today, where it used to be globally the majority of the disease burden, or the most of the disease burden, was from these communicable diseases. So think of malaria or tuberculosis. Today, it is chronic diseases. So these are things that I just described, things that are non-communicable disease, things that you don't get from a mosquito. But what we also know is that the majority of the risk factors for the global burden disease comes from corporate produced products. So tobacco, fossil fuel pollution, ultra processed food, and tobacco and alcohol. So we now have what we are calling, or has been labeled also as, an industrial epidemic of disease. And it has been going up at the same rate as some of these other things like plastic and chemical production. And now we have good science to link many of the chemicals that are used in the plastic life cycle to adverse health effects. So chemical production, you've heard, the plastic production, you've heard already many talks today about how it goes from the natural gas to the well, actually, Judith did a very excellent job on this yesterday, the ethane cracker and the processing. And there are chemicals used or produced in every component of the life cycle. So you have things like vinyl chloride, a known carcinogen, ethylene glycol, styrene, polystyrene, also a known carcinogen. And then you have additives, phthalates, which are, I will talk a little about their health effects, PFAS, flame retardants, bisphenols, and volatile organic compounds, so things like formaldehyde. And what that means is that also these additives, we have, then the plastics are produced, and then you've heard a lot of discussion and actually an excellent presentation about the macro and the micro and the nanoplastics that come from the breakdown and degradation of the plastics that are produced. So I want to say one of the things that we do at UCSF, and I know some of the people will talk about also today, is we measure these chemicals in people. And I just want to say this is really powerful because people get, oh, I find this chemical in the body, it's really terrible. But from a public health perspective, it's not that good because people have already been exposed to these chemicals. So, and many of them have been exposed before the government has done what they need to do to identify those health effects and prevent them, those exposures from happening. So this is from a study we did very early on when I was at UCSF, and before that I was at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, so I'm very familiar with how science is looked at there. So what I want to say about this is that we use data that's collected by the by CDC on biomonitoring, meaning measuring chemicals in people across the United States, and we identified that during pregnancy, people are exposed to dozens of these industrial chemicals. The ones highlighted are plastic-related chemicals. And so when we're thinking about, when people are talking about, oh, what do these exposures mean? You can't talk about these exposures as one individual. They aren't happening individually. They're happening in the background of other chemical exposures, all contributing some little risk to the overall risks. And so, like I said, the bottom line is we already know these chemicals are toxic. These are from high quality, what we call gold standard evidence reviews that have been done by the National Academy of Sciences, the European Food Safety Commission, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the state of California. And so we know these chemicals that are being found or used in plastics like perfluorinated chemicals, phthalates, flame retardants, bisphenols, and these volatile organic compounds are contributing to all those, are known or likely to increase the risk of the health effects that are increasing in the population. So dyslipidemia, which is cardiovascular effects, effects on immune function, effects on male reproductive health, effects on female reproductive health, impaired neurodevelopment. And also what you see in this, and this is also in the a table from the New England Journal of Medicine article. Also what you see is that these chemicals are also impacting the same health endpoint. So what happens is if you're exposed to all these chemicals and they're impacting the same health endpoint, you can get an increased risk from those multiple exposures. So plastics, the chemicals in plastics are related to these, can increase the risk of these adverse health effects. Okay, so plastic fragments in the environment. You've heard excellent talks about how these plastics, they are breaking down and they're measured everywhere, and that there are this whole group of things called microplastics. And I just want to say, when we did this report for the state of California, and we did the review of the health effects, it was pretty interesting because I usually work on these chemicals. I'm like, oh, phthalates or PFAS, and nobody knows what I'm talking about. When you say plastic, everyone knows what you're talking about. So it's been way better going to parties now. Anyway, so microplastics are, we've already heard, they are like little pieces of plastic, and they're invisible to into the eye, and they're small, and they break down. And I think the important point is they hang around forever. They don't like go away. They're just there. So one microplastic you put in, then you get another anyway, there's a lot of them. So I also, this is also, Judith did a great job on this, but I'm just going to say, I've been doing this for a long time, so maybe nothing surprises me about toxic chemicals, but I have to say this was kind of surprising. I was like, wow, clothes are a really big component of the microplastic problem. Like, I didn't know that. I probably should have, but and tires also huge part. So, even if you're not going to do microplastics, or just definitely sectors that have regulatory or policy opportunities to intervene. And then, as you've heard, that these microplastics break down, they get into the food supply. Judith's image was way better on this, but you get the point, is that they're getting around and we're getting exposed. And I did update my slide bit on Judith's slides, is that they're come in the air, they're in our food, they're in our water, and now we can measure them in every body part that people have measured. So they're in breast milk. You heard this yesterday, but I'm going to say it again because it's still stunning, right? Breast milk, feces, blood, testicles. That was an interesting one. And then the blood in the brain. So, and of course it makes sense. If you make these chemicals, you put them in products, they get out of the products and they get into us. I want to say that because sometimes people say, oh, we don't know if we're exposed. It's being made, we're being exposed. So we conducted the first systematic review on microplastics. A systematic review is the gold standard of how evidence should be reviewed in the federal government. Not everybody in the federal government does this. For example, FDA does not for these chemicals. And we evaluated over 2,000 studies. Now I'm just going to give the conclusion, which is that there is sufficient evidence in animals that microplastics are increasing the risk of digestive hazard. So these are linked to cancer, like colon cancer, reproductive health effects, male effects on sperm quality, and then respiratory hazard, that's chronic inflammation. So the overall label, based on the fact, is suspected, and I can talk about what the factors are that go into there, but suspected means that this is something that we need to be concerned about from a health factor. And then, as you've already heard, microplastics, and the other speakers will talk about how they contain these different chemicals that we already know can increase the risk of multiple adverse health effects. So I want to also just re-emphasize the point that exposures are unequal, that communities that live near these facilities that are making these materials have higher exposures to the pollutants that are, to the emissions that are both part of the production process and then the waste products that come from this. And so this is just puts more data fine point on the excellent talk we heard yesterday from the member of from the Descendants Project, looking at that Cancer Alley is also been well described as the increased cancers. So I think the key here is not that we need more science on this issue, but what are the regulatory and legal hooks that will flip the narrative on this. I mean, there's a role that scientists have to play in this in terms of how we use the science to illustrate the health harms that people already know are there. But I just don't, as a scientist, we do research, but I just don't think more research is necessary to have action in this area. And I just want to also, and this is work done by Ami Zoda, who's at Columbia and others, and just talk about that these plastic materials are also used in products, but not like, well, yeah, sure, we got the whatever, the plastic water bottle and all that, but they're using cosmetics and different types of factors where groups, we have documented that have higher exposures. So in this case, there's a racial disparity in phthalate exposures because Black women and Hispanic women have products that they're being used that have higher levels of these phthalates due to social racial pressures to conform to certain types of beauty standards. And so this then results in a kind of perpetual cycle of health inequities. So I'm going to end because we have some other excellent speakers, and I heard this comment about tobacco yesterday. So I just want to say, you know, we have been in a situation in the past. The tobacco industry in the 60s was the third largest source of federal revenue. Like, they were big money in the United States. They produced billions of dollars, even though they were killing people. So what was it that it took to bend the curve on tobacco? Well, some of it was science. Some of it was documents disclosure and knowing that the tobacco industry is lying. Some of it was legal actions. And some of it was policies that force people to not smoke in places. Like, we're not smoking here, right? Well, maybe someone's smoking, not here, but, you know, somewhere. But you can't, but my point is that today it looks totally different than it did 20 years ago. And tobacco companies were big business. I mean, they're still big business. So it is possible to take on companies who are harming people and do it in a collective way to reduce their impacts. So the real reason I came here, I mean, of course I want to tell you about my research, but the real reason I came here is because UCSF is also home to the largest documents, publicly accessible, searchable, tagged collection of corporate documents in the world. And we started off with the tobacco industry documents that a lot of that came from the litigation, from the collective action that were done by the AGs against the tobacco industry. We now have food documents. We have some pharmaceutical documents. UCSF is adding the opioid documents that came from the opioid settlement cases. They just uploaded, I saw yesterday, the documents from the Juul settlement cases. We have a small collection of chemical and fossil fuel documents. And so what we want is your documents, because that is the truth of what the industry knew. That's the truth of what the industry knows. And then we don't have to talk about what they knew, because we can just look at what they say in their own words. And then we can do that kind of empirical research. So research from this archive has been instrumental in demonstrating how the tobacco industry knew the health harms of their product, and gives us the empirical basis to show that industry-funded science, for example, will be biased compared to academically funded science. It also led to many of the laws and the world treaties that we have today. So this is an opportunity for all you lawyers out there to contribute to future good, is to include documents disclosure as part of any settlements that happen related to the plastics industry. Okay. Because we're just doing research on their own words, and it's like a great set of research. So we know that chemicals and plastics can increase the risk of adverse health outcomes. You can take actions now. And of course, I have some more research we can do. So I'm not going to say we shouldn't stop doing research, but there's more to do. But the research should really be focused on things that will help move the needle on actions to make a difference in people's lives. So thank you. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, you can follow me everywhere. So.
Okay, we're going to move on to an international perspective next. Jane Monkey, is that right? Is the Managing Director and Chief Scientific Officer of the Food Packaging Forum, an independent research organization based in Zurich, Switzerland. She founded this organization in 2012 to research and communicate about health and environmental impacts of food contact materials. She has her PhD in toxicology and a Master of Science in Environmental Science, both from ETH Zurich, which she wants us to know is also the alma mater of Albert Einstein. You heard of him? I don't know. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I love coming to the US and being introduced as Dr. Monkey. It's fun. Thanks for having me. My name's Jane Munke. I'm South African. Sorry about that, Leslie. I know it's a hard one. I do have relatives who immigrated to the US, and they just dropped the E at the end, so they're known as the monks. But I'm not a monk, I'm a Munke. Okay. I would like to talk about food packaging. And I think we all are on the same page that this is important. It's been a part of the evolution of humanity. Ever since the Neolithic Revolution, people have had food packaging to store food. And in the 1950s, we started storing our food in plastics. And today, plastics are everywhere. Walk into literally any supermarket, not only in the US, but anywhere in the world, and you see this. And this has to do with the fact that plastics is not only technically functional for storing food, for preserving food, but it also fulfills many, many, many more of the functions that food packaging needs to fulfill in today's globalized food system, ranging from 24/7 filling lines that put out 3,000 products per second that get shipped around the globe, retail selling, and so on and so forth. So plastic food packaging is a result of globalization in the food system. What we care about in terms of human health and food packaging, I mean, there's many aspects, but I want to focus on this issue of chemical migration. So this is really old science. It's actually really not new news. This has been established for 50 years probably, or even longer, that chemicals can leach, can transfer out of packaging into foodstuff. And we call this migration. It's, if you ask me, a not so luckily chosen term, but we're stuck with this now. And this happens not only for the chemicals that are known to be indirect food additives, as FDA calls them, but also to all the other stuff that's in there, the non-intentionally added substances, which can be breakdown products, reaction byproducts, or impurities of your starting substances. If the molecules are small enough, they can transfer out into the food. This process happens faster if you have high temperatures. It happens if you have long storage times in the food. It happens if you have food with a fat content that is high, and by high I mean 25% already is enough. You'll get all the fat-soluble chemicals leaching out. Low acidity, which is your tomato sauce, your soda, for example. And it happens when you have small serving sizes, because there's a relationship between the surface area of your packaging to the volume of food. And if you shrink it down, your serving size, you have a proportionally higher surface area in contact with your volume of food, so you get proportionally more migration in smaller serving sizes. So this is a paper that has received quite a bit of attention. This was published last week. And this is a study that our group did, where we systematically looked at the food contact chemicals that we know today that have evidence for being measured in people. And we found 3,601 food contact chemicals that are known to be relevant for food packaging, for example, food processing equipment, and so on, detected in people. 1,347 of those are relevant for plastics. And this is a table that I want to show you, putting the whole issue in perspective. How relevant are these food contact chemicals in terms of other anthropogenic food contaminants like pesticides? And this slide is, I stole this, but it's a friend, so it's okay. Dr. Gregor McCombie is an analytical chemist who is an expert on analyzing chemical migration from food contact materials, and he works with the official food control authority in the canton of Zurich, which happens to be my home. And he put it like this: pesticides are very well controlled. We know the toxicity of these substances and their metabolites, and they are present in the ppb range, micrograms per kilogram food. Food contact materials and chemicals, up to 100,000 different chemicals. Most of them unknown, most of them unstudied in terms of their toxicity. Which means you cannot do risk assessment. And the level of contamination is 3 orders of magnitude above that, what we typically find for pesticides. The worst offenders, I will say, are recycled paper and board. And for that reason, in the country I live in, it is forbidden to use recycled paper and board in food contact applications. This is just a couple of terms. So this can be a little bit confusing. We talk about a food contact article as like the finished packaging product. So in this example, your yogurt cup, but it can be an extruder in your processing facility, or it can be your coffee mug at home. Anything that is purposefully put into contact with food is a food contact article. It can consist of many different food contact materials. So in this example of the innocent little yogurt cup, you probably have a polystyrene cup, which may have a label, paper label on it that is printed. There's an adhesive that sticks the paper label on, maybe an aluminum lid that is coated. So you've got 6, 7 different food contact materials in that example. But regardless of that, food contact materials and food contact articles are made up of chemicals. And we coined the term food contact chemicals. It's not a legal term. FDA doesn't use that. But we coined it just to simplify the discussion and to explain what we mean. We mean each and every single chemical that is in a food contact article for whatever reason. If it's a non-intentionally added substance or it's there because it serves a function, it's an additive, it doesn't matter. What matters is that food contact chemicals can migrate and people are exposed to them. And that's why we coined this term. Now, we've already heard about the regulations in the US. This is the legal definition of safety that FDA uses, which is safe or safety means that there's a reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists that the substance is not harmful under the conditions of its intended use. We also heard that there are hazardous toxic chemicals in food contact materials. And our own research and that research of Dr. Woodruff and many other colleagues shows that they get into people's bodies and they're strongly, robustly associated with chronic diseases that are increasing. This is just a different way to show the data that Dr. Woodruff already presented from the global burden of disease. Chronic diseases are of increasing prevalence globally, not only in the US, but worldwide, also in developing countries. And we know for many of these, not all of these, but many of these increasingly prevalent chronic diseases, that chemicals play a role. These diseases are multifactorial. Right? Think of cancer. You can have genetic predispositions, but it does not explain this increase that we've seen in a generation. So it's not just a genetic effect. There are many other effects, and chemicals are one of them. And the good news is chemicals are a risk factor that we can do something about. That's the good news here. Yay, yay for chemicals. Okay, just trying to wake you guys up. Okay, so if there's one thing you take away from today, I want you to keep in mind that saying low levels equal safe levels is not based on scientific evidence. If you want to know a little bit more about room for improvement, biggest room in the world, right? The room for improvement. In terms of food contact materials, we published this article here on the scientific challenges in the risk assessment of food contact materials. Don't worry, it's not just the US that has room for improvement. It's also the EU, it's definitely also Switzerland. So I think there's quite a bit of change in the right direction that could happen here. Now, just to be a little bit more precise on what's going on, in terms of risk assessment of these materials, this is the status quo. Right now, we look at single substances, right? We look at one substance at a time when we do this chemical risk assessment. And if tests are done, because there's not always actual tests being done on these chemicals, but if tests are being done, they focus on mutagenicity or genotoxicity as a proxy for cancer causation, right? And that basically ignores that these chemicals can leach out of food contact materials in mixtures, sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of chemicals at the same time. And we know that these chemical mixtures can have additive effects. And it also ignores the fact that there's more than just cancer out there. I mean, we showed you these graphs of increasingly prevalent chronic diseases. And I also want to add here that the US Government Accountability Office has analyzed the way that food contact materials are assessed for their risks to human health. And they published this report about 2 years ago, which you can download here. And they conclude, and I guess this is diplomat language, for saying, you've got a problem, guys. Another agency which recognized that we've got a problem is the European Food Safety Authority, which in 2023 published a scientific opinion on the chemical bisphenol A that we all know, probably. Maybe you're not aware that it's actually in beverage cans as well. It leaches from beverage cans into food and many other sources. And the European Food Safety Authority lowered the tolerable daily intake for this chemical, lifetime exposure to this chemical, by a factor of 20,000. The safe level for this chemical now to migrate from food contact materials is around 1 part per trillion right now. And even the best analytical chemists can only detect 3 orders of magnitude higher at 1 part per billion. So basically, we have a big problem here. We have a chemical at unsafe levels in the food supply that we can't even detect at the levels where it would be safe. This is a problem. And the science, sorry, I'm not going to get political, but the science is the same worldwide, right? It's not a territorial thing. Okay, so what's the way forward? I'll let you relax a bit. That's a picture from my home, well, where I live now, in Switzerland. I think the good news here is that a lot of brands, a lot of retailers have picked up on this issue. They're aware of chemicals in food packaging. We've put together a database, which is freely available, called BRID, the Brand and Retail Initiatives Database, where we track public commitments of brands and retailers worldwide in terms of their packaging. What are they doing about packaging? And a lot of the commitments pertain to recycled content use, and only very few right now, 10%, pertain to banning of chemicals, avoidance of chemicals in the products, and I'm hoping to shift that balance a little bit. Let's focus a bit more on getting rid of the hazardous chemicals. Of course, we want to reduce and reuse packaging as well, and then maybe recycle the ones that can be recycled. But it gives me hope to see that there is increasing awareness in the industry for this. And then if you ask me, what is my vision for safer food contact materials? And if you didn't ask, I'll tell you anyway. So I think that we need to shift away from looking at single substances that are used to make a material to looking at what are actually all the chemicals that are leaching out of finished materials and articles. Because on the way to making a material, these chemicals are transformed. They can change quite significantly. And that is what people are exposed to. So we should be looking at what the reality is of human exposure. So look at the finished article, measure the mixture of chemicals. And then also acknowledge that it's not just cancer that is a chronic disease we should be concerned about. It's cardiovascular disease, killer number 1 today, right? It's reproductive disorders, it's immune system disorders, it's brain or neurological disorders, and it's metabolic disruption, metabolic disorders. All of these can be affected by chemical exposure. So it doesn't make sense to me why we're not testing these chemicals that are in people's bodies for their impacts on these diseases. So fully safe to me means we use modern science. We test all migrating food contact chemicals on their impacts, for their impacts on all relevant chronic diseases. And to quote my mentor and good friend, Pete Myers over here, he actually said it on stage yesterday as well. If you don't test, you don't know. It's not enough to do some fancy computational algorithms to look at chemicals if there's, have some alerts for toxicity. It's just not based on science. So, and then if we do all of that, hopefully we can get together again at fun parties and enjoy fully safe food contact materials, whatever material they may be. But there's a way to go here. So just to take home, it's underestimated as a source of chemical exposure. We can prevent chronic diseases from happening by reducing exposures to these chemicals. Current regulations are inadequate, and they're not properly being implemented, and they're not being enforced the way they should be. So there's a big opportunity here. Use modern science. And allow me to make a personal comment here. I think what also is important when we talk about science, right? We all want evidence-based policies. We all want policies, regulations that are informed by science. Well, science is not negotiable. Science is science, and science is made and communicated by people who have no conflicts of interest and who are independent. And I absolutely encourage you to have dialogues and exchanges with all stakeholders, get all the perspectives here on the stage, but I'm not sharing a perspective here. This is science. And I actually object to being announced as sharing a perspective, because it's not a perspective. We work so hard as scientists to compile this evidence for you guys, so please treat us with the respect that it deserves. And with that, I would like to thank all of these wonderful people and many more that I collaborate with. It's such an honor and privilege to be part of this wonderful group of people. And I will be very, very happy to answer your questions and to also collaborate with you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for that interesting talk. Next speaker is Leonardo Tresande. He's a professor right down the road at NYU, and also an internationally renowned leader in children's environmental health. His research focuses on identifying the role of environmental exposures in childhood obesity and cardiovascular risks, and documenting the economic costs for policymakers of failing to prevent disease of environmental origin. Let's give him a great welcome.
Okay. I'm going to give you a screen break. So can you do me a favor and turn off the background, if that's okay? My name is Leo Tresande. I'm a pediatrician and epidemiologist at NYU Grossman School of Medicine, where I direct the Center for the Investigation of Environmental Hazards. And I've had the privilege of hosting a conference on plastic and human health that we just had on Monday and Tuesday. And so part of my job here, and I've been listening to each of the presentations because I had the wonderful joy of hosting Jane. You'll hear from Nihan shortly. I'm going to distill out what we take away from that conference and then edit out what you've already heard. And try to put it into perspective. So I'm going to begin by quoting Ted Lasso. Be curious. And if there's something I can emphasize just to start this presentation, it's to be curious about the invisible. So a lot of us have heard about microplastics. But if I can impart a crucial message, there's so much we don't know about microplastics, and yet there's so much more we know about chemicals used in plastic materials. We have a ton to do. Tracy really framed it well. And we know there's 16,000 chemicals used in plastic, and I'm only going to be able to talk about maybe 50 of them in a few clusters of chemicals of greatest concern. So where I'm going to focus my thoughts and presentation are really about bisphenols used in aluminum can linings and thermal paper receipts, phthalates used in personal care products and some of the softer food packaging materials. I'm going to talk about PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, those lovely forever chemicals that are increasingly coming into vogue for fluoropolymer plastics. And I'll also talk about flame retardants. We thought we had it done when we dealt with the brominated variety, but the phosphorus variety is well on its way, and it's in plastic. And then I just want to emphasize that when we incinerate plastic, we create dioxin. We saw it in the World Trade Center disaster, and we saw it most recently in East Palestine. And so when you think about these chemicals and what they do to human health, we have to think about the endocrine system. And here I'm going to channel not Vince Lombardi. This quote is misapplied to Vince Lombardi. It's actually to UCLA coach Henry Russell before him. He said, at least as far as I know, it may have been someone before him, but winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. I'm going to modify that quote and say the endocrine system isn't everything, it is the only thing. And that's because when you think about our hormones, there are signaling molecules. They underlie every basic biological function known to humankind: temperature, metabolism, salt, sugar, and even sex. And so some people in the industry will say, well, these chemicals can't do all the things they do to the human body. I mean, Tracy rattled off multiple lists of health conditions related to chemicals used in plastic. Oh, they can. Because when you mess with, let's say, thyroid hormone, depending on when you do it and how you do it, you disrupt multiple organ systems at the same time. So this is a grenade or a bullet, if you will, that explodes in multiple directions and shoots lots of different ways and causes lots of damage. And when we talk about chemicals used in plastic materials and their impact on human health, we're talking about cradle to grave. So let me just walk through that history and then give you a flavor of what we know. So we know, I've already alluded to thyroid hormone. We think of thyroid hormone as the temperature regulator, energy, etc. But in early life, the baby relies on thyroid hormone for the first 2 trimesters from mom. That functioning is crucial. And within the clinically normal range, you mess with thyroid hormone, even a little bit, cognitive deficits, autism, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And we know that the brominated as well as the phosphorus flame retardants mess with thyroid hormone directly. And multiple studies at this point have documented cognitive deficits, especially for the brominated flame retardants. And we know that phthalates exposure and pregnancy have been associated with changes in thyroid hormone levels. And then looking deeper, one of my colleagues at NYU, Gargasabian, did a study with a large Dutch cohort and documented that phthalates literally shrink brains. Prenatal exposure associated with lower brain volume, which is not a good thing, last I checked. Mm-hmm. And then she walked it all the way to IQ loss. So we call this in epidemiology a mediation path. That was clearly demarcated. So we can walk through the individual mechanistic steps by which these chemicals damage brains functionally because they hack our hormones, our signaling molecules. That's not the only thing phthalates shrink. Phthalates shrink babies. and intrauterine growth restriction is a big problem because what happens is the metabolic system is set and programmed based on your fetal growth. And if you shrink a baby, the baby adapts and then develops what we call a thrifty phenotype. So when the baby ex utero, after birth, processes calories, they store them more as fat. So we've actually done a series of studies in which we've documented increases in body mass due to phthalate exposure, but more importantly, it's not just body mass index or BMI. You've heard that body mass index is a complicated mix of muscle, fat, bone, et cetera. But we found phthalate exposure in first trimester pregnancy to be associated with fat around the heart. And studies have shown that in these children, when they're adults, the adult fat around the heart is the most highly predictive fat depot for heart attack, stroke, mortality, et cetera. We also know phthalates make babies born earlier. We did a study published last year documenting that 5 to 10% of premature births are due to phthalate exposure. $4 billion of economic costs due to medical care in the first year of life, as well as lost cognitive potential. Because when a child loses 1 or 2 IQ points, I don't notice, the pediatrician, I'm a pediatrician, I don't notice, no offense to teachers in the audience, the teacher might not notice, the parent probably doesn't notice. But if 100,000 children lose 1 or 2 IQ points, the entire economy notices, because each IQ point is worth roughly 2% of a child's lifetime economic productivity. So roughly $20,000 in US dollars at current rate. And so you add that up, those are big numbers. So I've talked a lot about children. I'm a pediatrician. I can do that till the cows go home. And children are uniquely vulnerable, don't get me wrong. But life is a window of vulnerability to chemicals used in plastic. So phthalates and bisphenols have been associated with early cardiovascular mortality in longitudinal data. Bisphenols are associated with diabetes. And by the way, in a longitudinal French cohort, it's not bisphenol A only, but bisphenol S. So we haven't talked a lot about chemical whack-a-mole. But the substitutes that are brought forth are as bad often as the chemicals are intended to replace. So this makes you very uncomfortable when you go to the supermarket or to the store and see BPA-free products. BPA-free doesn't necessarily mean bisphenol-free. Just to take a little tour through PFAS for a moment, and then I'm going to pivot eventually to microplastics, don't worry. They're hot, they're important, I understand. But PFAS not only shrink babies, but they've been associated with incident diabetes. And nothing I'm talking about here mitigates the importance of diet and physical activity in obesity and diabetes, by the way. But in a study where adults lost weight through healthy dieting and physical activity, the PFAS levels have been measured, and zip, the weight came right back in relationship to the PFAS levels. And when they looked deeper, the resting metabolic rate was lower. Now, I run a lot. That's my little lifestyle thing that I do outside of work. And so I nerd out about resting metabolic rate and things like that. But for the general audience, it's your burn rate of calories. You know, it's your fuel factory, if you will, or your thermostat. So if you turn the thermostat the wrong way, that's going to set you up for gaining more weight because you're going to, again, absorb calories and hoard them. And that's likely how PFAS contributes to obesity, among other things. It's not the only pathway, but it's the pathway we have mapped down. Now, you've heard a lot about microplastics in the media, and I'm glad that Richard Thompson's slide was up there with the concentrations that have been documented in all the different body tissues. That's terribly important. But I want to be clear that we still are not really clear how much microplastic we eat or ingest. It's at least a credit card a day or whatever, I suppose. The numbers that you've seen these credit cards be bandied about. But we're still working out how to measure microplastics. Let me be very clear, particularly in human tissues. There's the type of plastic. There's some researchers find certain colors better. We can detect presence or absence really well. And within a population, if you measure everything the same way, you're going to have a consistent signal in that population. So I'm not throwing any studies under the bus when I say it, but I can't tell you how much microplastic we really ingest, let alone nanoplastic. And so I'm not taking anything away. So you may have seen this New England Journal of Medicine article where they measured the plaques in carotid arteries of people. And they related the microplastic contamination to a 4-fold risk of heart attack, stroke, and even death. That study is bona fide. I'm not mitigating it, but I want to emphasize a point. Remember what I talked about, be curious about the invisible. We had already, a few years earlier, related phthalates to early cardiovascular mortality. So from a legal perspective, from a preponderance of doubt perspective, my sister's a deputy AG in New Jersey for civil rights, so I am not going to touch her turf. I'm going to just back away and simply say that there are multiple threads of evidence now that suggest that plastic, let's not debate microplastic chemicals used in plastic, are directly linked to cardiovascular disease in a substantial way. And we've extrapolated that it's roughly 50,000 people dying a year between the ages of 55 to 64, $20 billion of lost economic productivity. So I'm going to bring this home now by talking about costs, because these are industries that profit at some level from making plastic materials. We have known for a while that endocrine disrupting chemicals contribute substantially to disease and disability in the US and in Europe. And policies produce changes in exposure. Exposure contributes to disease, and disease ultimately costs us all. So when you look at US and European differences in endocrine disrupting chemicals, there's this important point that I need to make when you look across the studies. In the US, the costs are much higher, $340 billion a year, than Europe, 163 billion euro. Still, we're talking about 1 to 2% of gross domestic product annually. This is not a trivial thing. But when you drill down deeper, it's because we required flame retardants be added to furniture, and which is plastic, by the way, polyurethane foams, to prevent the spread of fire. And so we had a legacy of a generation of people who were exposed to flame retardants. 1 log unit higher, 3 to 10-fold higher than anywhere else in the world, except for NAFTA, which sent these chemicals to Mexico and Canada. And so that point's really important to emphasize as I roll into and hone in on what percentage of that endocrine disrupting chemical disease is due to plastic. I want to add first, $340 billion US a year. That didn't include PFAS effects, which we've estimated at $5 to $62 billion a year. We hadn't added the phthalate-induced mortality of $20 billion a year. We hadn't added the premature births at $4 billion a year. That's roughly, I'm not going to do my math on the fly, $400 billion a year. So let's hone in on the plastic subpart that is really important here. And this is where I think there's a misunderstanding in the general consciousness. A large amount of plastic, of endocrine disrupting chemicals is due to plastic because we don't recognize plastic in our lives the way we should. All the paint that's on these walls, plastic. Nail polish, plastic. Jane's already talked about food packaging, plastic. It's more insidious than meets the eye. And so we looked at the percent of PFAS in people's bodies, the percent of phthalates and bisphenols and flame retardants in people's bodies that were directly related to plastic. And we took a hack out of that $400 or so billion cost estimate. And what's left when you drill down to plastic attributable disease costs in the US, we're talking about $250 billion a year. Now, mind you, that's an annual cost. It's based on 30 or so at most chemicals used in plastic materials. We know of 16,000, 4,000 are known to be toxic at minimum. So we're just chipping away at a little tip of a big iceberg. And we didn't even look at all the diseases due to the few chemicals we studied. And a health economist would look at our paper and say, well, you left a bunch off the table in terms of the disease burden. So this is an extreme underestimate. So I'm going to close by emphasizing a couple points of what we need to do about it. Recycling is only going to be a bridge. It's not the solution. We need to reduce plastic production and consumption, full stop. Tracy showed the increase in plastic production and consumption. There are only a little few jagged points in that curve. The oil crisis of the 70s, the 2008 financial crisis. We are on this inexorable, and I don't think Tracy's curve quite shows that exponential part of the curve that's really important. We need to, if we are going to continue on this, we will magnify endocrine disrupting chemicals used in plastics in people. The measurable levels will continue to increase, period. And they will increase in low and middle income countries to boot. I know we're a US audience, but that's important to emphasize. And we know there's environmental racism embedded in these because there's disproportionate exposures and disproportionate burden of disease and cost borne by African American and Hispanic Latino populations who have higher levels of these chemicals used in plastic. So, recycling for a moment. One point I want to make is that recycling magnifies chemicals used in plastic because you recycle it in a mosh pit of all this other trash. You pull out metals that shouldn't even be part of the story. Polyethylene plastics doesn't have phthalates. Well, guess what? You mix up polyethylene plastics with polyvinyl chloride plastics and a host of other things. Phthalates are going to go on the ride. So when you put food in polyethylene recycled containers, voila, you have phthalates in there. Joy. And now bioplastics. I want to make a point about that for a second, just thinking ahead, because a lot of people are touting that as a solution. Bioplastics are, Nihan will explain it, are more climate intensive than regular plastics. I didn't shock you by saying that. I didn't mean to step into your lane. I'm stepping right back out. But what we know is that bioplastics they're biologically active. They're more oxidant stressor and endocrine disrupting than the normal chemical plastics that we're using today. So in the solution space, we have to push really harder. Now, I'm just going to close with one last thing. I don't know if I've run over time. Perfect. So our conference really brought to bear some of the leading companies that are trying to do the right thing and not use plastic. And I think we have to drive consumers consumers are hungry for these alternatives. They're aware, they want to do the right thing. And if there's anything I just want to leave you with is that we also need the carrot and the stick approach. You all have really big sticks, but we also need carrots, and those companies need to be supported, and we need to work to support that broader change we seek, because it's going to come bottom up and top down. So thanks for the opportunity, and looking forward to your comments.
All right, and now to introduce our last panelist. Nihan Karali is a policy researcher at the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Systems Department at Berkeley Lab. Her research interests include technologies and policies for accelerating clean energy transition, circularity of materials, and sustainable decarbonization of various sectors. She focuses on designing technically feasible, cost-effective, and sustainable decarbonization pathways and she'll be speaking us today about the climate impacts of primary plastic production. Let's welcome Nihan.
Hi, everyone. Good morning again to all of you. So I'm from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, one of the 17 national labs of Department of Energy. We hold up to now 16 Nobel Prizes. I want to just start with that. I'm not one of those. I wish I was that smart. But today I'm going to talk about climate impact of primary plastic production. I know my friends touched the other side of the plastic pollution, but this is where our expertise and research portfolio sits. And should I use this or just call next? Okay, so I will start showing what happened so far in terms of plastics growth, consumption and production, and what is expected. I know Tracy showed the 1950s to 2019 chart. This is shorter, but our consumption and production of plastics are greatly accelerated since 1950s, since plastics are widespread in our lives, right? I'm gonna give a couple of numbers here. So this last 2 decades, if you look at it, the annual production growth rate was 3.6%. This is global chart, right? This number took us from 2000 to 2019, doubling of the plastic production to about 460 million ton. And if you look at what was the share of recycling in that versus primary, the recycling has a very small share globally, which is all the way mechanical recycling this rate, by the way. 6.3% is global recycling rate. The rest of it all come from primary plastic production in 2019. And in the pie chart on the right or left, depending on where you are doing, if you look at that, you'll see that 9 very common plastics in our lives are about 80% of this total production. These includes very common ones, like polyethylenes, 3 types of polyethylene, polypropylene, PET, PVC and PS is mentioned as problematic plastics by my fellow speakers, polyurethane and others. And there are other styrene-based plastics there as well. And what are the expectations? Like Leo touched upon it a bit, saying like the growth trajectory is big. I'm showing here 2 trajectory. One of them is mediocre, 2.5% per year growth, which is OECD analysis based on. And there's the 4% based on another research, which is much closer actually to the 3.6% annual growth rate we saw in the last 2 decades, right? So this is like the backbone, backstory I'm giving, because some of my results are actually based on these growth rates and the numbers. So I want you to remember specifically 2.5 and 4% growth. So here, this chart shows the linear production value chain of plastics, and Steven kind of touched it with more details on chemicals, but I'm going to be more broader. So it starts with the extraction or mining of the fossil fuels needed for the plastic production, and it ends with the shaping of the final product, right? And we have multiple stages in between. And plastics need fossil fuel for 2 purposes. One is the raw material, because we know that about more than 98% of the plastics are based on fossil fuels, right? The rest is bioplastics like that, 1.5 to 2%. And also plastics need fossil fuels for energy consumption, for heat and electricity production, right? And in between of these first and last steps, we have multiple processes. When I say multiple, it's actually could be like hundreds of processes. A same chemical goes in and returns to another chemical by combining chemicals, and then goes into another step and then turn to another chemical, which at the end of the day, we have polyethylene, right? For that, we refine fossil fuel. We have fossil fuels, we refine them. Sometimes we use them to actually generate other chemicals on the way, but sometimes we only need them for our monomer production. And monomers are the backbones of polymeric materials. We use monomers like ethylene or propylene to manufacture polypropylene or polyethylene, which are our polymers, plastic polymers used for plastic production. So each one of these steps has significant amount of GHG emissions associated with them. And I'm going to show a chart from our findings. So these findings are from our recent report, which is published in April, right before the INC for discussions. And it has actually used and cited in the discussions a couple times to make the point stronger that plastics also has a climate impact, right? So when you look at all those production stages and chemicals used in the processes and what kind of technologies we use, you see that when they are combined, what we found is they generated 2.24 gigaton CO2 equivalent of carbon dioxide GHG emissions in 2019. This is about 5.3% of the same year's total GHG emissions. And if I give a couple of comparison points, in the same year, the aviation sector itself generated 0.6 gigaton CO2. And this is almost 4 times higher than that, the entire production value chain. And if you look at the entire transport sector, it generates, including aviation, 8.3 gigaton CO2 GHG emissions, right? So this can show you the scale of primary plastics production chains GHG emissions impact. So if you look at pie chart, you see different polymers impact on this total GHG emissions. And what drives this is, of course, the volume, is an important factor, but also the complexity of the production. So if you remember the previous chart, in the previous chart, polypropylene and PET it showed that they had almost the same volume of production level in 2019. But when you look at here, you see PET actually has significantly higher emissions, which shows us PET production is more complex. It requires more chemicals, chemical processes and more chemicals, so it drives the emissions significantly higher. My point here is not every plastic polymer or plastic product has the same footprint. Some of them has higher footprints because they are more complex. They have more chemicals involved in their production. So from here, what happens in the future? What's going to happen if we go the way we are producing and consuming productions? And we look at this 2.5 and 4% annual growth scenarios, which brings us in 2050, doubling or tripling of the total GHG emissions, depending on the annual growth rate, right? So we are in there. So what does this mean for our remaining carbon budget to limit global warming to 1.5 degree Celsius threshold? So I know there are lawyers here, so I'm going to just repeat how Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change defines carbon budget, okay? So it is the net amount of carbon dioxide humans can still emit while keeping global warming below a given limit with a given probability, taking into account the effect of other climate forces as well. So in this chart, we are using 2 probability, 50 and 60% chance of staying under 1.5 goal. And the middle line is the 2.5% annual growth, right? If you look at that, we see that under our current production structure and the consumption portfolio, primary plastic production could account for our remaining carbon budgets 21 to 26% of our remaining carbon budget, depending on which probability rating you're looking. If you go to 4% annual growth scenario, it's the top line. It's 25 to 31% of our remaining carbon budget. And if you assume that production stays at current levels, we freeze the production, the flat line on the bottom, it can still have our 15 to 19% of our remaining carbon budget. So those are the sum of the statistics or comparison point you can take. So we talked about the stages of the primary plastic production, right? So how much of each stage contributes to how much of these total emissions? So why is this important? It's important because I want to say, even in the Global Plastic Treaty, it's still not clear that where the plastics life cycle starts, actually. There are discussions it could start in product shaping, the last stage, or polymerization. But what we see here is actually 75% of the emissions are happening way before that. And most of the monomer production specifically has a very high share, like 26% you're seeing here. And monomers like ethylene is like heavily used for plastics. So if there's no ethylene, I want to say there's no polyethylene, there's no PET, there's no some of the other polymers we have, right? So that's an important point to make. So we can't just think it's not in the plastics value chain because it's used there. And like 85%, I think, is the rate of ethylene used in plastic. And then if you look at the hydrocarbon refining or other chemicals that are not fossil fuel based, together they come up to 29% of these emissions. And extraction itself also includes like fugitive or vented methane emissions from the wells, right? So it also goes up to very high levels, like 20%. So let's assume a scenario that we are going to decarbonize our power grid based on the stated policies or goals globally. How will this affect our results for future remaining carbon budget, right? So yes, we see a drop. It's about 25% drop in 2050 on total emissions, annual emissions. However, if you look at the total carbon budget impact, there's not much actually going on there. So the carbon budget, primary plastic production can still have 17 to 22% of the remaining carbon budget under the moderate growth scenario of 2.5%, and it could still have 21 to 26% of the remaining carbon budget under 4% scenario. So this is like 5% change if you look at the absolute numbers, right? Yeah, and let's also discuss a bit how easy or how it's not easy to decarbonize this sector. I don't have a chart showing you how complicated it is, but some of my fellow researchers have. And then those charts are like spaghetti in your plate because multi-products are going into a process, and then multiple different products are coming out from there, and they go in different places, and then, you know, like, again, it's just extremely complicated and linked to each other, right? So it's really, really difficult from that structure to take out a product in isolation and put a measure on it and hope that it will work, because we know that there's going to be rebound effects on other products, right? Whatever you do a single product, this is economics, like this is a production structure. They also have other products they can heavily invest on, right? So what I'm trying to say is it's really, really difficult to take one product or one technology and one process it, work on it, and hope that it will have the impact you're hoping. And some processes like steam cracking, which is the monomer production, most of the monomers like ethylene and propylene comes from this steam cracking technology. It's sometimes called as the heart of the chemical facilities because everything goes in it at some point and everything comes out from that. So that technology requires really high temperature. It could go up to 850 or 900 degree Celsius temperatures. This is a very high temperature to electrify. And I actually know that there's a pilot plant in Germany trying e-cracker, which is working without steam. However, it's a very small scale, and I was told that we are not going to know if it is going to work efficiently until the end of 2026. And they are not even sure what will be the yield, because it's a completely different process, which is not based on steam, right? CCS, carbon capture and storage, this is also considered or in the talks for this sector if it's the way to decarbonize. But I worked on other heavy industry sectors quite a bit so far in terms of decarbonization, like steel, aluminum, and cement. All I can say is this technology is with us since early 2000, and it's never scaled to the level we want it to be, if it's an option. And the reasons are not just economic. The economic barrier is there, but with this carbon capture and storage technologies, we are also facing ecological, environmental, technological, and social cultural barriers. So I'm gonna just leave it there. And let's also assume that, like, magically or miraculously, we found a way to, technology portfolio to decarbonize this sector, and we decarbonize it. But like I said, this primary plastic production, they use fossil fuel as raw materials. So the sector will always gonna be depending on fossil fuels. And I don't have that result. I didn't have it in the slides, but we also found that, I think it's on my last slide, about 12% of the global oil demand was from primary plastics. And about 8.5% of natural gas demand was primary plastics in 2019. So this is my final slide, and it summarizes everything I told so far in a compact version. So what I pointed is our research showed that the primary plastic production globally generated 2.24 gigatons CO2 equivalent of GHG emissions in 2019. This was about 5.3% of the same year's total GHG emissions. So these very common plastics commonly used in our lives, like PE, 3 PEs, PET and PP, had about 60% of this total GHG emissions. But we also saw that the problematic plastics mentioned, PVC and PAS, also has a huge share, like I think more than 16% it came from them. The other finding is the emissions related to production, 75% of them came from the steps before polymerization even happened. And if you look at our remaining carbon budget impact, depending on which scenario you're looking, the primary plastic production can have 15 to 30% of our remaining carbon budget. And the 15 is the frozen scenario, I just want to remind you. Yes, and then the last point I already mentioned. So, yeah, I think I'm going to conclude, and if you have any more time for questions, we can go, right? I don't want to have more time.
So we are already at the break time, but I know our panelists will not depart without answering all of your questions during the break. I wanted to maybe throw out one question to at least try to have a bit of a positive note, if that's okay. But for any of the panelists, can you give us practical suggestions about finding the good companies, or how to protect our children, preserve our food, or what the most important things to banish from our lives might be? So yeah, please go ahead, Leo.
I can start. So there are safe and simple steps that we can all take to reduce our exposure to plastic. They don't require a PhD in chemistry, and they don't have to break the bank. Fundamentally, it really starts with thinking about essential plastics and reducing to those first. I use the analogy a lot about getting on an airplane. So obviously one has to clear security with an empty stainless steel water bottle. I didn't bring that as a prop intentionally. But then you fill it, and that's not going to get me 14 hours. That's not going to get me to Busan, where we're going in November. That could take 2, Jane. You're absolutely right. Well, you're better than me in that regard, for sure. Exactly. But suffice it to say that you fill that water bottle, and there might be the rare moment where you really have to grab a plastic water bottle. We shouldn't feel guilt, is I think the other important point, because the system is rigged to support plastic exposure. But let me pivot back to what we do. So glass and stainless steel are great alternatives. Replacing our nonstick cooking pans with cast iron or stainless steel is important, particularly not machine dishwashing and microwaving plastic, because we've all talked about this. These are additives that are not covalently bound to the plastic. And if you wear down the plastic, there's the whole issue, as we've talked about monomers or micro, nanoplastics of various sizes coming into the food that way. And then the particular ones that I'm concerned about above all the other ones I'm already concerned about are the recycling numbers 3 for phthalates, 6 for styrene, and 7 for bisphenols and others that are there. And then just one really quick thing, wet mop vacuum cleaner, opening the window, recirculating the air, because these chemicals and microplastics do accumulate in dust.
Can I add
Maybe
one
each
thing?
of the panelists, if they could maybe take 1 minute and address the same question. So yeah, please go ahead, Jane.
Get rid of your plastic electric kettles. Every time you boil water in your plastic electric kettle, you're leaching chemicals into the water and
Okay.
microplastics
With heat.
with heat, yeah.
Tracy?
Yeah, just first of all, I want to say that we also provide tips on our website called Toxic Matters, Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment, which are evidence-based, and we give them out to our pregnant participants, pregnant patients at UCSF and other institutions. And I'm going to give the clothes tip. That was a good one. We haven't actually included that. So your clothes have plastic, so try and buy natural clothes that are not made from plastic. And I'm just going to re-emphasize, not guilty. You should not feel guilty because this is being foisted on us, and so that's why we also emphasize engaging voting. Here in the United States, you can vote, register to vote. So that's really an important thing that individuals do.
Jeff?
I would just like to say that we get these questions from our large clients as well, who are very concerned about the environment and these issues, and they're looking at trying to find solutions as well. Lots of the bad chemistries that were mentioned here are largely being removed from food packaging material today. FDA had a discussion on Wednesday about their post-market surveillance program, and on their website they do have a good discussion about what FDA is doing to remove chemicals of concern from the food packaging. So I think it's a good place to look to start.
And finally, Neha.
So my expertise is not lying here, but what I will say is education and trusting science is the must, because we clearly have science to back up what's taught here. Educating ourselves and people around us is the thing to go, and it's science-based education.
Wonderful. Let's thank the panel.
Hi, everybody. It's time for a break. I'm going to give you the full 15 minutes, and then we'll get to the next panel. So enjoy the snacks and enjoy each other, and please come speak to any of these panelists with your questions. You did submit a lot of really interesting ones, and I hope you get them answered.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Welcome to our final panel, Solutions Part 2, Achieving Circularity Through Innovation and Other Means. I'd like to announce we've added a 5th panelist, Leah Segui from Pew Charitable Trusts, who'll be joining us virtually. But before I welcome our esteemed moderator to the stage, I just want to say, on behalf of myself and the Connecticut OAG, a profound thank you to the State Impact Center, Bethany Davis-Knoll, Madeline Collins, Jessica Bell, Megan Abrun, and Jasmine, and I'm not going to say your name last night, sorry, Elbekroui, and the rest of the State Impact Center team, without whom none of this would be possible. So thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause. Please may welcome to the stage Heather McTier-Tooney. Thank you so much.
Well, good morning, everyone. Okay, we're gonna have to do better than this. I know it's the last session of the day, last session of the conference. but you also need to know I am Southern. I am from the great state of Mississippi. I am also a recovering politician. So, and I know I'm talking to some people who are elected officials, so we get each other. You cannot walk into a room or a community and act like you cannot speak. So we're going to try that one more time. Good morning, everyone. See how that works and sets the stage so much more beautifully. I am the executive director of Beyond Petrochemicals. It is a campaign designated to stopping the expansion of harmful petrochemical facilities throughout the United States, but particularly in areas that are overburdened and impacted by pollution and are, in some spaces, marginalized communities. If you had the opportunity to listen to the amazing Joe Banner last night, that's one of the areas we work in, and you understand the stories that are so significant and why this work is what we must do. At the same time, like I said, I'm a recovering politician. I started my career as a mayor, and I also served as the regional administrator for EPA in the Southeast. And so we know that when you talk to your constituents, when you go to the grocery store and just talk to everyday people, they want to know about the solutions. And that's what this conversation is about, the solution-oriented focuses that we need to take and consider as we are moving forward in this conversation. So let's close out and ensure that we're all walking away with things that are empowering us, ready to work towards improvements within our individual and our broader communities, keeping in mind, again, what's important to people every single day: public health, safety, jobs, the economy. These are the things that are concerning and in the kitchen table issues that we have to talk about, because we want to make sure that as people are preparing the next generation of their lives and their children, they don't have to worry about if they're doing it and they're going to be alive just to the next day. So this is a very important conversation. I thank you all for being extremely tuned in, and we have an amazing panel that is going to help us through this discussion. And I'm going to ask folks to kindly identify yourself and your organization, give us a very brief overview of your work. Stick to 5 to 7 minutes. Now, I did tell you, gave you a little bit of background on who I am, so don't be surprised if I come over and tap you and say, okay, let's move it along a little bit. But no, in all good conversation and healthy discussion. So let's start on the end with Brett Biggers.
Biggers. I'm senior economist at REMA. That's the Recycled Materials Association. We just rebranded in April. We used to be called ISRI, the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries. Everything that we do is the same. It's a name change, so it's easier to identify what we're doing. So people identify with recycled materials more than they do with scrap. So at REMA, I'm also the staff liaison for the plastics division, the paper division, and the MRF committee. So it fits in with the residential side of the recycling equation. So every day, our members and the recyclers receive high-quality, sustainable raw materials from products brought to our operations at the end of their useful life. That's what we're talking about now, is how to recycle more plastics and some of the issues that are involved in plastics. We are continually innovating through the industry with our partners, our community partners around the country, and we help them better sort and recycle the materials that they receive. We are also working with brands and manufacturers to design an easier recycle, we're working with our brands and manufacturers to design products to be easier to recycle and incorporate more recycled materials into a wide range of applications, from the essential infrastructure like bridges and roads, and then everyday items like laptops and cars. One of the innovations that's going on in the plastics recycling industry are the use of optical sorters and robotics. It's allowing the better sortation of the different plastics. So things just 10 years ago that used to go to the waste stream in a MRF are now being separated, sorted, and recycled. So that's one of the major innovations that's going on. The other thing, we have listened to the brands that we're working with, and they have established an effort to go away from plastics to fiber-based packaging. And so we're agnostic with the materials that are being recycled, but we do listen to the marketplace. So we created a new tool. It's called the Fiber Recycling Readiness Tool, and it allows brand and packaging engineers to go online and put the attributes of the package and determine whether it will flow easily through the U.S. residential recycling infrastructure. And that website is fiberrrt.org, if anyone wants to look at that, fiberrrt.org. I'll end it there.
Well, thank you so much. Dr. Veena Singla, we'll move on to you next.
Thank you so much. And I'm a scientist, so I do have slides. I love the slides. Can't talk without them. So I'm an assistant adjunct professor at Columbia University and associate director of the Agents of Change and Environmental Justice program based at the Mailman School of Public Health there. And my research focuses on our systems of materials production, use, and disposal, understanding and analyzing harms to communities along the full life cycle, especially those who are disproportionately impacted, and transforming those systems so they are no longer a source of harm to communities and instead support community health and wealth. So this picture here, I chose specifically. What you will see, there is no plastic in trash in the picture. It's this picture taken up high from a trail in the Bay Area, because I feel like when you go up high and look around, you can see the lay of the land and kind of take a step back and get beyond some of these problems that seem really overwhelming and try to see the path forward, a vision for the future, this beautiful world, and our more harmonious place within it. So what does this path forward look like to address plastic pollution? So first, it means we can't only focus on packaging. We heard a little bit about this already. I'll just highlight that building and construction is the second leading use of plastic, and without intervention, that sector is expected to double in production volume by 2060. So that means we could successfully phase out plastic packaging, and we would still have a huge plastic pollution problem. Okay, here is my required life cycle slide. The organizers told anyone who had slides, you must include the life cycle slide. So here we go. So we know that plastic is made from fossil fuels with toxic components, emissions and hazardous waste at each stage, and that disproportionately impacts low-income communities and communities of color. I also want to point out that these benefits of plastic that are talked about packaging for fresh and healthy foods and medical products, those are disproportionately not available to these same communities. So not only are these communities disproportionately harmed by the production of plastic, but they receive little of those benefits as well. So very deep inequities. So the generation of the monomers, those backbones of the plastic polymer, generates toxic pollution and hazardous waste. So in our research, we found that the manufacture of chemicals to make polyurethane plastic generated millions of pounds of toxic waste in the US, and primarily in Latino and Black communities along the Gulf Coast. And many monomers are themselves toxic, vinyl chloride, styrene, both cancer-causing chemicals. Linking up those monomers to form the polymers also generates toxic emissions, and we heard a lot about these toxic additives that give plastic its properties. I also wanted to point out that recycling, so mechanical recycling is that first arrow there on the bottom. also generates hazardous emissions and microplastics. And the most common form of chemical recycling also generates hazardous emissions, waste, and microplastics. So one chemical recycling pyrolysis facility in the US generated almost 500,000 pounds of hazardous waste in just 1 year. So recycling and reusing more plastic, unfortunately, does not make it a safe and sustainable material because of these inherent truths. You're going to be recycling and reusing harmful chemicals. And even if by some miracle you got rid of those toxic additives, no matter what kind of recycling you're talking about, it generates harmful emissions and microplastics that are inherent to these plastic polymers, and it's always going to require some level of fossil fuel extraction. So we've heard lots of buzz around circularity, circular economy, making plastic circular. What does that really mean? So sorry for all of the text on this slide, but what I wanted to highlight is there's different definitions of circularity, but they have some common conceptual pieces. So there's eliminating waste in production, there's restorative and regenerative. So let's apply this to the plastics life cycle and ask the question, is this restorative? This is the opposite of restorative. Instead of restoring nutrients and ecological processes, this life cycle damages nature with toxic emissions and hazardous waste. Is this regenerative? A life cycle that is based on a non-renewable resource cannot, by definition, be regenerative. Eliminating waste and pollution. It's not possible to eliminate the toxic pollution associated with the plastic life cycle because it's inherent to plastic composition and chemistry. Plastic will always generate microplastics, for example. So recycling and reusing plastic does not make it a safe, sustainable, or circular material. And it does not alleviate the disproportionate harms to communities. So what do we need to do? Reduce and cap production. We heard in the previous session about plastic's significant contribution to GHG emissions. This report modeled that we need about a 75% reduction in production to meet those Paris targets. And ODI did some helpful analysis of how to phase plastic out of some of the largest sectors of use, packaging and construction. And it turns out we actually know how to buy and serve food without plastic and build homes without plastic and other buildings, do many things without plastic. So reducing production is the most impactful intervention for reducing life cycle harms and phasing out non-essential uses and finding safer alternatives for the currently essential uses. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from Caroline Vanderlip. Caroline?
Like a fish out of water in this group, I must tell you. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the company I founded 5 years ago called Redish. It's a solutions-oriented company in a world in which there are no clear solutions or answers. So, you know, we're very early stage in trying to make reuse work. Redish was founded to reduce waste. We all know that it starts with, you know, use less, but then it goes directly to reuse. The problem with reuse is, how do you do it? How do you take the 1 trillion pieces of individual single-use food service products that are used in this country every year, food service packaging, how do you get rid of it? How do you apply reuse to it? That's really our focus. And our real focus is on answering that question from the software and infrastructure side. So as many of you may know, I don't actually know what this stat is in Connecticut, but I do know in New York City, there isn't a public school system in New York City that has a dishwasher any longer. I don't mean a person, I mean an actual machine. So, for instance, how would you apply reuse to the 1.3 million kids that are currently eating off of plastic in the New York City school system? But more importantly for us, how do you get them away from single use? I do want to share that I think the problem is single use, not just plastic. So when we look at the marketplace, we are just as concerned about compostable products, which as far as I can tell, and you guys are the scientists and AGs, but as far as I can tell and we have analyzed, are just as bad for the environment as single-use plastic. It actually takes more energy and water to manufacture a compostable product that is not composted than it is a single-use plastic, which is not me saying that we should use single-use plastic, just trying to compare the two. What does it take to reuse? It takes a huge amount of operations, infrastructure, and software to counterbalance the fact that most schools, most universities, most corporations, any place where there are large amounts of people eating, they don't actually have the real estate, the facilities, the labor, or the machinery to reuse product at those locations. So what Redish did is it set up a reuse facility outside and essentially created a service very similar to uniform cleaning and laundry cleaning, et cetera, for the outsourced reuse of materials. Sorry, so sorry. Our first one is in New York. It was built in 3 years ago. We then opened an industrial washing facility in Philadelphia, and we are 4 weeks away from opening one in Boston. What does that mean? That means that we've created an assembly line, essentially, to take reusables, any material, to logistically pick them up, collect them, and deliver them, to bring them into our facility, to sort them, to track them, to wash them, to sanitize them, and to put them back into use. We can do about 75,000 reusables a day on each line, on each assembly line. That assembly line is a combination of some customized equipment that we actually purchased in Germany, which is the only place and the only manufacturer that actually can create dishwashing equipment that can be customized to be able to handle lots of different materials for both washing and drying. I hate to say this in this group, but as many of you know, if you're using plastic reusables, which is what most reusables are today, they don't dry in a dishwasher. You're home, you put your Tupperware in, it comes out wet. You can't scale a reuse solution if you can't both wash and dry. So we've customized some equipment. We've built some automation to address some of the very labor-intensive components of dishwashing at scale to be able to deliver back into the market a huge number of reusables that in turn can save water, save carbon, avoid carbon emissions, and divert a significant amount of waste. We washed, just to give you a flavor of scale, we'll wash about 3 to 4 million units this year. That is waste diverted of over 300,000 pounds in a very short period of time, and a corresponding amount of carbon and water that's not used. I think the most important part about what Redish supports is data. We're very concerned that the plastics industry and a lot of food suppliers are actually starting to question whether reuse is the better environmental practice. And there's no question that it is. After 3 uses, the carbon reduction and the water reduction looks like a hockey stick. And there is no debating it, but you really need data to support that. So we built Redish on a data framework. Every SKU that we take in, that we wash, is tracked with a unique ID. And when we return the environmental metrics to our clients, it is on their actual usage. We know that certain, like a reusable plate will use less water than a 9x9 clamshell container. Small things like that. But being able to measure everything and then aggregate everything both at the client level as well as at the reuse level. So you all heard Crystal yesterday talking about the kind of infrastructure that's needed in order to make reuse more universal. That is our goal, and we are doing it in the New York, Philadelphia, and Boston markets with the goal to be in 30 markets over the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 2 panelists that are joining us via video. We'll start with Julia Cascella.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm the Director of Packaging Innovation and Reuse at Systemic. I actually grew up in Farmington, Connecticut, about 45 minutes away from New Haven, so I'm really sad that I can't be with you there in person. I'm dialing in from a very rainy London, UK today, where I've lived the last 12 years, so great to connect with you all. The last 7 years here, I've been exclusively focused on plastics. It's a really fascinating area. It's so fast moving. It's an area you can really feel some hope in, despite how vast the challenge is. So I hope that today we're going to really look at the solutions and share some of that hope, some of my personal optimism of where we can get to. So I work at Systemic, we were a global B corporation. Our mission is driving systemic change for a circular and low carbon economy. Specifically on plastic, that means we have about 50 experts working full-time on plastics and systems change. We've published a bunch of solutions-focused reports that go into a lot more detail than I can cover today, but take a look at our website if you want to read up on any of the topics and figures that I share today. And we've done a lot of work focused on the US specifically as well. So great to see some of the policy momentum picking up in the last few years in that market behind these solutions, as well as a lot of the startup space and investment flowing in the right direction. My role in Systemic is as Director of Packaging Innovation and Reuse. So I'm all about driving innovation for systems change. These are big words, innovation and systems change. I can lay out how we see those 2 things for plastic solutions within Systemic. So for innovation, I'll call out my 2 big areas where I think we need a big innovation and solutions mindset. The first is I'm going to totally agree with Redish here that reuse is a big area that we need to push. Our analysis Breaking the Plastic Wave suggested that 25% of all packaging could move to reuse by 2040, maybe more than that if we get more into the innovation space and with solutions that we haven't developed yet. But these solutions are available at least in different geographies around the world, so it's now about replicating them and working on solutions with players like Redish and people on the ground. For reuse, there's also a lot of promise in the US. I've seen data that reuse for non-alcoholic beverages is somewhere between 5 and 10% reuse already in the US. So you have like huge amounts of water cooler infrastructure actually in those returnable bottles that you put into a water cooler. There's a huge logistics network picking those up. These are the type of innovations we need to grow more. Also things like concentrated and powders and syrups. I grew up with powdered Kool-Aid in Connecticut, and my morning OJ was from frozen concentrates. So, you know, these solutions are out there and have potential to grow also through things like SodaStream. The second area I would call out for innovation is new materials. So we'll get into this in more detail, I think, during the panel discussion, but there's a lot of excitement around developing new materials and alternatives for plastics. The perfect solution is not out there. There's no silver bullet, but there's some interesting stuff coming down the pipeline and good use cases where different materials makes more sense. The second big theme I want to talk about is systems change. So I like to think of what we need to do in terms of systems change for plastics in 4 key kind of themes. Like systems change can be pretty overwhelming. The first is data and monitoring. So what gets measured gets managed. We all know the phrase. One thing Systemic's worked on in the past with the recycling partnership actually in the US is creating Packaging IQ. It's a free to use digital tool. You can use it now online. It helps quantify plastic impacts and quantify how much it would cost and what the GHG implications would be moving to different plastic solutions. So this is giving you a lot of data and monitoring capability through Packaging IQ, and there's some good movements to better measure and track things like how recycling performance is happening, how companies are getting on with targets. I know a lot of them have signed up to EMF's global commitment on plastics, etc. The second element is collective action. One big thing we're working on in that area is CGF Reuse City. So really bringing reuse to scale across the city, and we've landed on Ottawa to launch a big trial there next year. Third area for systems change is policy. We work a lot on the Global Plastics Treaty, and I'm really excited to tentatively see that the US delegation is starting to get higher ambition on the Global Plastics Treaty here, and that could be a real game changer for conversations. I'm also loving seeing the movements for EPR in the US. This seems to be a huge wave of momentum. We have 5 states with EPR, 12 discussing EPR, and by 2030, this is a lot of states are going to have this. A huge proportion of the US population will be in states with EPR, and that's a really key piece of policy to drive action and solutions. Even in the reuse space, our latest mapping suggests 50 pieces of legislation in the US are either passed or under discussion relating to reuse. So we're really seeing some good momentum in policy area. Final systems change area, financing. Our Breaking the Plastic Wave analysis suggests we need $100 billion globally per year to finance innovation, specifically in plastics, to get over the gap between the technologies we have available today and what we would need to get to zero plastic pollution. So there's some interesting innovation areas, reuse, new materials, etc. $100 billion can sound like a lot, but we're already investing that much in AI per year. And actually in plastics, we're already investing 30 billion a year. So we're on the right track. It just needs a big scale up and a big shift in focus. Including through blended finance, like government getting involved with the private sector to drive financing. I'll leave it there with some high-level themes. Hopefully we'll come back to some of them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Julia. And our final panelist today is Leah Sigwe. Leah is with the Pew Charitable Trust. Thank you so much for joining us. Leah, I'll turn it over to you now.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Leah Mupasigi. Again, I'm from the Pew Charitable Trust, and today I'm calling from the West Coast, calling from Eugene, Oregon. So if you're unfamiliar, Pew is a non-governmental organization. We actually just had our 75th anniversary last year. And so for just over 75 years, we have used data to make a difference. And use data to address challenges of a changing world by illuminating issues, creating common ground, and advancing ambitious strategies to lead to tangible progress. So at Pew, I'm on the Preventing Ocean Plastics team, where we use data to inform policies to reduce plastic pollution. Just a quick background, I'm a marine and freshwater biologist by training, and I was trained by those who use math to understand a changing world. And so with that background at Pew, I support our research efforts, I do my very best to keep up with the new science, but there's always so much of it. And I also work with project partners around the world who have expertise in their local plastic value chain. And what I do is that I work with them, I share our tool called Pathways, and I support them in turning their information into action. So that's real brief on what I do. I'll just keep it short. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Leah. And we've heard a lot of information, I think really diverse perspectives on how we're thinking about solutions. The themes that have really stuck out have been the importance of data, how are we moving and changing behavior in order to really, I think, lean into how we're reducing not only plastic usage, but impacting health, and then what are the pathways in order to make this a reality. I want to, though, sort of dig into the data piece and start with you, Leah, and you, Caroline, because you both identify these as really key indicators of how you're determining next steps. Leah, I'd love for you to tell us some of the challenges that you faced in collecting data. And then, Caroline, if you could sort of follow up with that, not only the challenges, but I've been to a reuse facility, so I've seen it firsthand, and it is really cool to look at the back of a plate and see the scan and the number, like if you're the 54th person, or to be able to use that particular dish. But can you both sort of talk about these challenges and what you're doing to overcome them? Leah, let's start with you.
Sure. I'll bring up two things. First is data transparency. So earlier we've seen pictures of a plastic value chain. You know, we're going from plastic production to waste generation to recycling, waste management, and pollution. And when we're trying to put this picture together with the data that's available, you know, we find that so much of the data that would be helpful is proprietary or behind paywall, or it's otherwise confidential because it has sensitive information. But it holds really key information of trying to figure out, like, what does our whole system look like and how could we change it to make a difference? Improved disclosures or transparency in data would help paint a much fuller picture and make our efforts in modeling and using that to inform policies even stronger. The second is on data harmonization. And so this is a really recent example for me. Right now, I'm in the process of going through state level and city level waste characterization studies around the US. And I understand that different jurisdictions have different things that they're interested in, things that they care about. And so what they measure and how they define things or lump certain plastic groups is to help answer their own questions. But for someone like me who's trying to take all this information together, when there's different definitions out there and different ways to measure, it makes it challenging to make one cohesive picture. And so, you know, what I feel like the challenges with data harmonization, and I'm sure people who work in data could empathize with this, is, you know, I feel like we're working with puzzle pieces that don't quite fit together well, but we do the best of what we have. And hopefully we could bring enough of these puzzle pieces together that when you take a step back, it gives you that picture that you're looking for to help figure out ways to make change. And so I'll leave with that.
Caroline?
Oh my God, there's so many ways to answer this, but we built Redish on a data framework for a variety of reasons. First, we needed data to convince institutions to move to reuse. Reuse today, because it's so new, is more expensive than a single-use product, regardless of the material. So why would PepsiCo or Barclays or L'Oreal, all of which are now Redish clients, why would they choose to move to reuse when it's more expensive, especially in the absence of legislation? And the answer is because we could show them that there was tremendous benefits as it related to the environment, and these are companies with very specific zero waste goals. I will tell you, however, that the next layer of institution, what we call the reluctant followers, is not so quick to hop on in the absence of legislation. So I would, other than for the California folks who are here, where there is a lot of legislation taking place, I would really ask all of you to start to think about, you know, what we can do from a policy perspective to make reuse the standard. The second piece is to convince users that reuse is the way to go. You know, we've talked about it over the last 2 days. It's a real behavioral shift. What we found, however, is that by giving them the data of what they individually can contribute to the health of the climate, we are actually getting acceptance way faster than you would normally get to a behavioral change. So, you know, if you go to Barclays Bank in any of their buildings or campuses, you will find, I was just there earlier this week for Climate Week, and I was astounded at the number of Barclays employees who came up to me, looked at my tag and said, Redish, we love Redish. And part of, you know, they love Redish because they can contribute to climate in a way that most individuals feel that they don't really have a stake in it. There's nothing they can do. You mentioned one of the little pieces we were able to do with data is because each product has a unique UID code on the back, which we use to scan when it comes in, it's also used to show individuals how many times that particular cup or plate or clamshell container has been washed. How many, you know, pieces didn't have to be manufactured for single use because that existed. And it really allows them to embrace the idea of reuse much better. Why is that important? It's not important solely because Barclays or any of these clients are forcing them into reuse. It's important because of the way it actually then waterfalls into other aspects of their life. We actually did a survey of one big law firm 5 months after they launched Redish. And what we found is that 1/3 of the respondents already were starting to apply circular practices in other aspects of their life, just because they had been you know, educated in their work environment about the benefits of reuse. Most of it was in fast fashion, which really made me feel great. But you know, it's really hard to teach a new behavior like reuse one consumer at a time. So our focus on institutions and the data to support that institutional delivery became really, really important on a lot of different scales. We also use data to manage the assets. We use data to analyze how many times it can be used before it gets taken out of rotation by SKU. You know, where does it go from there? There's a lot of ways that we use data that we think is really important for reuse to really flourish.
Sure, go ahead.
So at REMA, we understand the importance of that data too. And so for the second year in a row, we have tri-sponsored some research that Stina Incorporated has done on the amount of recycled plastic, post-consumer recycled plastics in America. And so in 2022, which is the latest year available, data was just released the first quarter of this year, it shows that there's 5 billion pounds of recycled materials from PET to HDPE and all. And so this way we can quantify what's going on in the post-consumer recycled market. There's a data gap here, and that's the industrial plastics that are being used, the shrink wrap, stretch films, and other industrial-related packaging, as well as other materials that are being recycled from car bumpers and other products like that. So we hope to look further into that in the future. And so it's circularityinaction.com if you want to go look at the data. Or you can go to Stina Inc., STINA Inc.com, and look at the data that's been presented.
Well, Britt, let's stay there for a second because I think both you and Caroline and everyone really has talked about, we know the importance of that data in order for us to help and understand not only behaviors, but pulling in the policy perspective, because I know you mentioned the legislative policy as being a key piece, and Brett, dealing in recyclables is a really challenging area because there are some concerns around public health and microplastics in the body, and how does that impact the public health of a community. So what are some of the legislative or policy efforts that your organization is supporting that helps us to address those real very serious concerns that communities have about their health with recyclable materials? I'm going to give that to Brett, and then I'd love, Vina, I know you've worked on the policy side of this as well, too, because it can be a sticky space.
So REMA is looking at the environmental justice communities, and we're doing a lot of work on that. We're also looking at product stewardship, or EPR, and other government actions where applicable, where there is not a known market. So it's for the hard to recycle items. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but those are some of the overall venues that we're looking at.
Vina? I'm sorry, I should call you Doctor. I apologize. Forgive me for being informal.
No problem. I only asked the chemical industry to call me Dr. Singlam.
Okay.
So yes, from a public health perspective, thinking about the many exposures of concern over the life cycle of plastics, the most impactful policy interventions are the most upstream, because you get then you reduce the impacts along the full life cycle. So we're really looking at source reduction. How can we eliminate, reduce the production of plastics, because then you eliminate and reduce these harmful exposures and the harmful generation of microplastics. Hello.
Hi, good. How are you doing?
Interesting. And I'll really agree with what Caroline said about the policy support needed to move away from single use and these unnecessary and problematic uses of plastics and other materials, because any material has an impact, right? So we really do want to look at systems and processes that reduce our reliance on these single-use disposables and excess kind of use of materials. And one initiative, I was previously with the Natural Resources Defense Council. They were doing a lot of work on eliminating subsidies for the fossil fuel and petrochemical industries. I think that's a very powerful way to stop incentivizing these materials and systems that are harming people and harming our health. And I would love to see those incentives move to fund systems that are going to be much more healthful and supporting community health and wealth.
Julia, you also mentioned reduction as well as one of the places that is ripe for innovation. Are you seeing entities that are looking for alternatives? Can you talk about that a little bit? How do we get to the reduction using alternatives to plastic?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I mentioned there's no silver bullet when we're reducing plastics and replacing them with another alternative material. You really have to look at the trade-offs, the use case, the exact kind of the carbon emissions impact, and other environmental and impacts. So there's like the waste hierarchy, right? At first you want to reduce, then reuse, then recycle and get to be using plastic. So really the focus on reduction and reusing is like before you then look at what other materials you should be using. So that's one thing I would say in the reduction agenda. You should think about like what can we actually get rid of in the first place, or what can we reuse, rather than just switching a single-use plastic item to a single-use other material item. In particular, you could look at kind of the direction not to go in. I'm seeing Europe moving a lot from PET bottles, which are really recyclable, they're safe, they're very low amounts of microplastics. I mean, the health concerns are real, but also not so quantified. And if we set up a real alarm bell about microplastics being the biggest health risk out there, we might end up with solutions that have really bad implications for health in other ways. So I'm seeing a lot of those PET bottles moving to single-use glass, and that weighs, 20 times or maybe 20 times plus more and is much more carbon intense, and it's just a quite bad trade-off to say that we're going to move everything to glass. Now, reusable glass you can start getting more interested in, but the single-use to single-use transition, you do need to be a little careful about it and not just think that anything that's not plastic is a great solution that we should be rolling out as fast as we can. So be aware of trade-offs. The other thing where I'm more excited about is we haven't found really good solutions for flexible plastics. They don't have high recyclability rates. Even technically, they're quite challenging to recycle. You'd need to usually scale up something like chemical recycling, pyrolysis technologies like this to really get valuable material out of flexible packaging, like your bags that's on fruit or other flexibles. We're seeing a lot of the companies that we work with getting pretty excited about paper-based alternatives to flexible plastics. So you can imagine a thin paper-based bag that replaces the plastic bag. There are trade-offs to that as well. We care about issues like forestation, sustainable sourcing. You need to make sure that that paper better be really thin to be worth it. But in places where that flexible plastic is going to end up at a really high likelihood of being littered, and we know it's not recyclable, such as in emerging economies, you might look at that space to say, okay, that could be a trade-off worth doing, to say that paper that has a value for recyclers to collect off of the beaches and get into a recycling unit is a good switch. So there's a lot of interest and excitement looking where fiber-based solutions can play. We're going to also need some really good innovation and solution mindset around sustainable sourcing and recycling of paper as well. So no silver bullets, but some cool innovations. Last thing I would point to is the waste to material space. So there's when you can use waste sources as inputs rather than virgin fiber or virgin plastics, that's a really interesting place to look in. So there's some types of biodegradable plastics, like PHA has really good properties of biodegradability, and not all biodegradable plastics are created equal, but I'm personally quite excited about like PHA as a solution. There's options to source that from waste, where you get some kind of fermentation process on food waste, and then you make it into these plastic alternatives. So some really interesting stuff happening there. Doesn't have the same performance properties as we have in the mainstream plastics today, but hopefully we'll get there with innovation and more work. So there's a few areas I'm tentatively, cautiously excited about in the new materials space.
Love that. We think that we've talked a little bit about scalability. And how do we scale these? And I'm really curious about how do we not only scale these, but how do we get community buy-in in a number of these places? I'm always fascinated when I hear the statistic about New York schools. It sort of blows my mind because I cannot imagine that type of use in a place like the Mississippi Delta, where simply the affordability of disposable single use is just not it's not prevalent in low-income communities. So the idea of not having a dishwasher really blows me away in a massive area like that. How do we scale the infrastructure that's needed, but also how do we get some of the community buy-in for these ideas so that we do begin to see the behavior change? I'll let we're in open session now, so anybody can jump into some of these questions. I'd love some good dialogue here.
I'll take this. I think you've already got communities, lots of them, very interested in finding solutions. Mm-hmm. The problem is there aren't a lot of solutions today in the market. The whole, especially on the reuse space, is so nascent. It's very, very early on. So there aren't facilities that can do what we do in most markets in the US. And then there's the subject of materials, which we've been discussing for 2 days. We know what doesn't work. We don't really have an answer for what does. That's been my frustration in listening to everybody. There are clear problems with plastic. There are, we haven't talked about it here, but there are clear problems with stainless steel from an environmental standpoint. Glass is way too heavy. Shouldn't be using glass in schools and other locations. Also can't be used for reuse because of its weight. What works? I mean, we don't yet have the solution to these problems, so we're doing the best that we can in the meantime. But to your point, there's already a lot of community support. We just won a contract with the Needham, Massachusetts public school system, which is moving from compostable trays to stainless steel trays and using us to do all of the logistics and washing because they can't do it in-house. So we're starting to see, and that was all driven by community. That was the point I was trying to get to. That was all driven by the PTA, the school system, the town, et cetera, wanting to finally do something about the waste that was created by single use, not just in the school systems, but in the town at large. So I think you're starting to see movements happening. We just need ways to propel them faster.
Go ahead, Brett. I was going to ask, do you have,
Yeah.
are there community initiatives that you're finding successful?
Well, it's not so much the community initiatives I wanted to address right now. I was just going to point out that the market has sort of decided that plastics right now is the best material for many of the products that it's protecting. So there are issues with it, but if you look at the lightweighting of plastics, the fewer truckloads that are needed to send the same packaging material amounts to get filled, all those reasons with glass, as you mentioned, it's heavier. And plastic bottles don't break, so there's fewer emergency room visits by people going to the park and stepping on glass and getting stitches and all that. So when you weigh everything and it's a complex, scale, it shows that plastics is vital to our distribution system as well as our food distribution and everything. So with that in mind, everything has to be balanced as has been mentioned.
So what we need are alternatives.
And so alternatives, and the U.S. Plastic
I guess
Act.
I would ask that question, especially right now we're in the middle of major hurricanes that are happening across the Southeast, and so one of the responses that we see quite often are massive amounts of single-use plastic water bottles that are sent to a low-income community because they need water. But I don't know about anybody in this room. It is very difficult to fill up a bathtub with a whole bunch of 8 or 12-ounce single-use plastic water bottles. And then the next question becomes, how do you deal with that in your community as waste? I think that's where I'm trying to get to. Where are the innovative ideas that are shifting the behavior of what becomes a problem for a community? How are we thinking about alternatives that actually get people what they need without harming them in the process? Because those are things that are not only significant and expensive for communities, but they're also harmful from a health perspective. So are there alternatives that we're thinking about that help us in emergency situations like we're dealing with right now?
If I could jump in, I'm not speaking specifically to that kind of use case. I would just say I agree with Caroline that there's really quite a lot of public support for addressing plastic pollution and reducing plastic production. The polling is off the charts, and that's across the political spectrum. You're talking about 80–90% support for policies to reduce plastic production and pollution. So the public and community support is there. Everyone understands this is a problem, and I have a slightly different take on alternatives. I would say the idea of reuse is not new at all. This is the systems that we had for a long time before plastic, right? So we know how to use these systems, and people of a certain age will remember never having a single disposable anything in their school cafeterias or cafeterias that they went to. So we actually do know how to do this. The same with building and construction materials. There are many readily available, safer, far less toxic alternative materials on the market today that are cost-effective and already deployed in building materials and alternatives to single-use and packaging. So I think there's that we have the information we need about the harms of plastic, and we have a lot of solutions already available. We really need the policies to focus on limiting plastic production and phasing out the most problematic and harmful chemicals and polymers, and moving to these safer systems and materials. So both sides of that, to really focus on regulating and limiting plastic production, as well as supporting and incentivizing the alternatives where it's needed.
I think, well, first I'm going to age myself because I'm in that group that doesn't remember disposables in elementary school. But we have some questions from the audience, and if you do have questions, please, I believe there are people who can help you to get those down and get those up here to us. We want to go back to Leah. There's a question: what does your data show about the role of recycling?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Julia had said earlier, in that there's no single silver bullet, right? We know that we cannot recycle our way out of the problem, but we know that recycling is a waste management strategy, and it's not working well right now. And so I think it asks more questions about how can we improve recycling? How could we shift our materials so that if we, starting from the top, we need to reduce plastics, so there's just fewer plastics overall. We need to build in reuse systems so that we could have these materials to carry the things that we need and to use the stuff that we need. And then for the plastics that we still rely on, that we can't get rid of, how could we best manage that waste? And again, recycling is not the only solution, but it's a tool that we have right now. So how could we best improve it?
For Caroline, you mentioned Pepsi and other companies as clients of Redish. What is the reuse potential there? Does Redish envision playing a role in replacing the single-use PET bottles and snack food wrappers?
Oh, in my dreams. Right now, we're servicing their employee population in their corporate buildings. So for all of those companies, we started out, as I said earlier, in the business and industry sector, because we knew that there were a lot of corporations serving a lot of people every day, using single use in an environment where they couldn't reuse because they didn't have the, as I said, real estate, facilities, labor, et cetera, to be able to do that in-house. So it was an opportunity to explore reuse, educate around reuse, train around reuse. Our goal is for everything eventually to be able to be reused. Or refilled. I don't want to forget that, because it's just as important. We think the whole trend, I don't know if it's a trend, but the whole practice of a lot of grocery stores now, allowing you to, fill a container that you either bring in or that's there and that's reusable. These are all small ways that we can not eliminate, but reduce the use of single-use materials. So yes, I don't think it's happening anytime soon. We're currently working, I just want to mention this, not that it's relevant to your question, but I think it's important. We're currently working with a very large university in Boston to take their retail operation, which services over 1 million meals a year, and make reuse the default. And I think that's another thing that we haven't talked about here, which has nothing to do with legislation, right? It's that when you create an environment in which default is the first option and single use you pay for, and you pay extra for, you start to change the economics of reuse. And so I think it's another way that we seriously need to think about how to get reuse into the everyday behavior of users.
Brett, what are some of the biggest challenges and successes that you can highlight on your recycling system?
So I'm going to take a step back and just say that the U.S. Plastics Pact, some of their goals are the things that we're talking about right now, about reducing the production of plastic, increasing the circularity, expanding the reuse. And so REMA is a longtime activator or slash member of the U.S. Plastics Pact. And so I just wanted to point that out, that there are initiatives, and that's one of our partners in trying to achieve some of these innovations and things going forward. So when we're talking about post-consumer residential plastics, there's a lot going on in the market and innovation. Some of it's new, some of it's older technology that's being implemented in the MRFs. So there's a whole wide range of MRFs that have the sorting technology. Some are still using hand sorts. One in the Midwest just opened up this year, about a couple months ago. They have the latest, greatest. They have like 16 optical sorters, so they can sort the different types of plastics into like materials, so they can send those to the reclaimer for processing and then turning into pellets and then into new product. So we're seeing that happening a lot more. There's the EPR laws that are going on in the 5 states now. Most of those are calling for the pros to implement the money that they're going to get into their MRFs, into the recycling infrastructure, so more plastics and more materials can be sorted and then processed. The other thing is REMA has it's called the ISRI specification still. We're still going with ISRI right now, so there's less confusion internationally of whether the specifications have changed or not. We're looking at the HDPE specifications. Recently, Stina Inc. put out some research showing that HDPE tubes are recyclable. We have 2 of the biggest reclaimers in the industry that are saying they will accept them. And so now we're working with MRFs so they can identify these tubes, separate them into a separate bale, and send them to the reclaimer.
I just got a wonderful note from someone for all of us here to take an action item, and that action item is to ask people to turn in your name tags so they can be reused. So in real time, let's be practical and make sure. I think there's a little container sitting downstairs on the first floor when you exit, and it is important to not only do that, but also that we actually reuse them. I know sometimes we'll make those collections, and then the next time an event comes up, we go right back out and buy more. So that's a great reminder. Here's a question, and maybe Julia, we can come back to you on this to start us off. Just in a practical way, what are alternatives that you suggest, like restaurants and things people can do to change, like, and see this use in takeout and in take-home food? I don't know about you all. I have that drawer, like most people do in your house, that's full of little ketchup packets and all the little things that they give you when you take out food, and you just sort of throw them there. How do we shift that, and what are the alternatives that we can use in that space?
Great question. Some of those smaller items like straws and stirrers, the EU has made a big push to say those are not allowed to be in plastic. So now they are switching to paper alternatives, or just not providing a stirrer, and you use your own spoon or whatever. So they've done a really careful impact assessment on the trade-offs there. So there's some of those small format items, they're never going to get recycled. They're high leakage out of the system. They end up on beaches. There was a call, at least in the EU, to really ban those and move away from them. The ketchup packets, if I'm not mistaken, that's high on the list of kind of possible to ban discussions that are happening at like the global treaty level, straws, small items like that. These are like the low-hanging fruit that are going to be under a lot of fire to say we need to find alternatives and to just push those through. Someone mentioned reuse as the default. So these kind of bans help push that change because it will take effort to move away from our current way of doing things and move to these other solutions. With ketchup, we're seeing a big push in France, for example, where single-use items for sit-down is banned. The last year that's been enforced now. So McDonald's, Burger King, all of these places now, you can't sit down and use any single-use items. The ketchup is now in like a pump bottle that you put into your tray. All of the clamshells are like washed on site, etc. So with ambitious policymakers on the table, you can drive change really fast. I mean, we were working with some of the clients and suppliers during that shift, and they were, it was a hard shift for them, but yeah, they're making it work, and it's in the early phases that still needs to be optimized and to get things right, but they're on that track. In the absence of policy, that shift is likely to be much slower because of what's been brought up in the panel so far about having more effort, sometimes higher costs to move to these things. But once you're at scale, the costs come down. So once you've really, we've had 70 years to make the plastic system really, really efficient, and reuse hasn't had that, at least in the new generation of reuse solutions, hasn't had that time to become more efficient and all the ways that we need to wash and get things back onto shelves. Yeah, that's one thing I'd say. Even in France, when I went to a conference very similar to this one that we're all participating in, it was my first time going to a event cafeteria stand, and everything was served in reusable packaging. And instead of there being a bin for you to put a trash can to put all of your stuff in after you eat your lunch, there was just a collection bin that got rewashed, and then the caterers, filled up with food again. So when there's a will, there's a way, and people are incredibly innovative to find these solutions. We need to work out how we can get past the status quo and be pushing some of these solutions.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'm going to say that from the takeout side, in many of the markets that you guys live in, there are small, struggling operations that are trying to deliver reuse at the restaurant level. Support them. If in New York, I just know it's Deliver Zero. In Boston, it's Recircables. These are operations that allow you to take your takeout meal in a reusable and then return that reusable, most often than not, to the network of restaurants that are part of that program. If you've got restaurants that you take out from on a frequent basis, ask them to join the network. Start to use your voice to tell them what you're looking for and what you're willing to do, and your pocketbooks, right? If you don't support these companies, they will not exist a year from now. And they are trying to push reusables into the market, but it's very, very hard on a kind of onesie, twosie basis. It needs the public, back to your comment earlier, on the restaurant level, it really needs the public to support it. The restaurants look at it as, it's just another thing I have to do. It's another thing I have to buy. If they don't have some pressure to know that you'll support it, there is no reason for them to do it. So it has to come, it's a push-pull, and it has to come from both the demand and the supply side.
There's a quick follow-up to that. Are there some consumer groups that are easier to work with than others in the context of material loss? And are you seeing their a shift in consumer behavior on the handling of reusable materials? What's the loss look like?
Yeah.
And has that improved?
I think it's an important question. It's hard to answer really quickly, but I'll say the following. We started in business and industry because the businesses were willing to pay for the loss as part of doing business in reusables, right? For them, the extra $1,000 or whatever it might be a month was something they were willing to absorb in order to bring reusables to the population. In the business and industry side of our work, we are seeing on average a 95% return voluntarily. There are no hooks in that. But generally about a 5% loss per month. That takes, to get to that 5%, takes a lot of training and education, all of which is part of our program. We have a 6 to 9 month rollout of gamification and activations, and all of which is just to remind people to put it in the right bin. I mean, we're not talking about complications here, but again, it's that change in behavior. So right now, business and industry for us is willing to pay that cost. In general, however, when you start to go to universities and hospitals and senior living residences and entertainment and sports venues, they are not willing to accept that loss. They believe very strongly, and I don't disagree with them, that the accountability has to be with the user. And so the analogy is the library book. You take the library book out for free, but if you keep the library book, you pay for it. So, you know, how do you encourage behavior economically? There's no additional cost if you return it, right? But if you don't return it, if instead you put it in your drawers in the kitchen, unfortunately, somebody has to pay for that. Who pays for it?
Yeah, that's great. We are nearing the end of our session, so I want to get each of you to close answering what I think is what we really all want to know. First is, what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and what data is missing from solving that problem? Brett, you want to start us off with that?
Sure. So the problem we're trying to solve is how to get people to recycle more, right? And some panels talked about it yesterday on consumer behavior. So that's one of the problems that's being looked into. Another problem is the outlook that people think that that plastics, but the recycling system is broken, or that plastics aren't recycled. And I think Kate Bailey yesterday with APR had mentioned something about 70% of what's put in the bin actually comes out a new material and is used a new product. The unique thing about plastics is not all plastics that are created are meant to be recycled in the same year that they're created. If you look at your auto bumper, as was mentioned, and you look at sewer systems and toys and other materials, they're meant to last for a long time. Vinyl siding, meant to last for a long time. So these are some of the products that we have, and so plastic recycling is a thing. It's actually happening. We need to have consumer behavior put more of it in the bin, and at the same time we have innovations that can sort it better, and so more can be recycled.
Yeah, so we have a public health and environmental crisis on our hands, and we know very well what the problem is. We don't need more information. We heard the summary of thousands and thousands, troves, stacks of scientific studies showing that these fossil fuel plastics are a problem. They're harming our health, and we cannot recycle our way out of this problem. And I want to address this idea that the market chose plastics. Consumers demand plastics, and there's two really big problems with that. One is there's a serious information asymmetry and distortion with what individuals were told and believed about plastics. One, that they were safe, they didn't have harmful chemicals, that using them wouldn't expose them to microplastics or harmful chemicals, that they all could be recycled, that they all would be recycled. And there's documentation of industry malfeasance and deception on this point, that they knew decades ago, these petrochemical companies, that these things were not true and that recycling was the way to gain public acceptance of these disposable products. So I think that information distortion is something that all of the government and AG folks in this room are very poised to address. And the second is that these petrochemical companies have spent millions upon millions upon millions upon millions every year lobbying against policies to restrict plastics. Communities want, people want. Since the 80s, they've tried to restrict polystyrene. No one wants polystyrene littering their streets and their lakes and parks. People tried to restrict it, and the companies have spent millions upon billions of dollars stopping policies that communities want. So the current situation is not some natural occurrence that people chose. It was very much created by petrochemical companies interested in their profit, and we can reverse this situation and go back to not using plastic all the time in every aspect of our life, because we did it before and we can do it again.
Ditto. No. We are obviously trying to put the systems and infrastructure in place to bring us back to a time when we were not such a disposable society, where we did reuse bottles and, the milkman. Not that I want the milkman to come to my door, but it's the analogy that everybody used. We used to be a reuse society. We did not need to purchase all of these disposable products. And our mission at the company is to move us, away from disposable and to really try to impact our climate health as the mission of the business, doing it through bringing us back to reuse.
I can jump in.
Julia, okay. Go ahead, Julia.
Sorry, I can't see where the microphone is being passed to, but I'm happy to jump in. Two things I'm really focused on solving right now. One, when I'm thinking about system change for plastic, is how we can close the loop so that those putting plastics on the market feel more responsibility and ownership for what happens all the way along the value chain. There's so much interest in the solution for this here, and what's missing is EPR policies. When you are participating in the global treaty conversations, EPR is like the policy that everyone agrees on. I've seen great momentum behind EPR policies in the US from all sides of the political spectrum, and lots of good state-level conversations happening around EPR. So that feels like a really tangible, positive tool that helps make sure that people putting plastics on the market are designing it so that it can get recycled, and then are also contributing to making sure that municipalities can afford supporting the recycling infrastructure of that recycling to actually happen. So you're really closing the loop in responsibility, helping all of the stakeholders talk to each other. We're a big fan of EPR and the key role that it plays in system change. The second one that is the problem that's come up a lot in this conversation is scaling reuse beyond these small scale examples or specific use cases to real system changes. There's a lot that you need to get right for that shift. But the one I'm excited about as a solution for what's missing is collaborative action. And there's some great examples of where that's happening. So Petaluma, we see a lot of the industry and takeaway sector working together on reusable beverage items, including all the big beverage players working to get all of Petaluma switching towards reusable items for beverage. We have Reuse Seattle working with schools, working with venues, working all over the place to push reuse. We have Perpetual working on 4 smaller cities across the US to build reuse systems. And then we have the work that Systemic is doing with the Consumer Goods Forum and 6 brands and 2 large retailers on scaling reuse at the city level in Ottawa. So there's something really nice about saying you can't solve reuse in a really small location. If we think about the city scale and get the municipalities talking to industry, talking to service providers, talking to all the logistics players, then you can really start getting something efficient and smart off the ground. So collaborative action for reuse and EPR legislation would be my 2 kind of what's missing solutions to focus on.
Thank you. And Leah?
Thanks. It's like the 2 questions that I'm left with is, one, like what does change look like? What is that future that we're imagining for ourselves? And I think this panel and this conference has been a great example of like what are the different ways that we're trying to make change in reducing plastics, in building reuse systems, in making recycling work. And it's very exciting to see so much activity happening, in our own individual bubbles, whether that it's home or work, school, seeing changes at state level policy and pushing for changes nationally. And my big question is, with all these activities that are happening, what do they all mean together? Collectively, what is the difference that we're making? And so, like, hopefully we could get information on the types of changes that we're making to see that we are indeed decreasing that reliance on plastic and also the pollution that comes with it.
Thank you, Leah. It's been amazing to listen to each and every one of you and just sort of wrapping on the solution and the idea of hope and what we're working together to achieve. What I've heard here has been a collaboration. I think everyone is on the same page that we need to reduce plastic production. We know that this is not healthy for our communities. There's definite questions about whether or not the viability of this financially is an economic solution that we can depend upon in the future, and that the health of people in communities is paramount. We cannot continue to do something that we know has been harmful in the past. But I really love how this panel has expressed that we need to lean into what we know and be authentic and be honest, to be transparent. What I heard was cultural inclusion, to make sure that we are respectful of these spaces that are exploring what they need in their communities, and then working on policy efforts to make that a reality. I'm certainly hopeful by that. I hope that each of you all are hopeful by that as well, and that we're leaving here empowered to take these solutions to the next level. That we're leaving here in a space where we're connecting with each and every individual who has been a part of this conference in a way that helps us know what information and what data we need to have in order to get the solutions right for the communities that we live in. That's certainly what I'm leaving here with. And I feel even better knowing that I am talking to a group that is leaving and dedicated to their most important clients. I'm an attorney by trade, which is the public and the people that we serve. So please join me in giving a round of applause to this amazing panel. And you all have been charged with something to do. I don't want to see anybody walking around with a plastic or without recycling and reusing your name tag. Thank you all so much.
All right. Thank you, everybody. How are we feeling? A little tired, right? All right, ready for pizza? Yes? Okay, I'll talk about that in a second. First of all, let's thank again the staff here at the Hotel Marcel for their incredible work. I'd like Bethany and her team at the State Impact Center to please stand, and let's thank them for their work. We're already planning the next conference, Bethany, so this is a great conversation for the last couple of days. I want to thank my team in particular, Kayla Smith, Matt Levine, all the assistant attorneys general from Connecticut. Please stand. I want to mention again that the Attorney General Alliance underwrote a lot of the travel for all the assistant attorneys general from the 20 offices that are here. So thank you to AGA. And so for the people who are not normally part of Attorney General world, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for teaching us so much over the last couple of days. As I walk out of here, I think the sensation that I have is that there are so many people here that feel so passionately about these issues, that are really smart about these issues and want to do something. And I know that this will translate into action. Don't worry, I'm not announcing anything today. I know that's been buzzing around the room a little bit. Rob Bonta stole my thunder. But I just feel like there's so much energy and willingness to take action, and we appreciate all of you. I also really appreciate, we learned so much. There's so much I didn't know about reuse, for example, and reuse strategies. It really helped me think about the demand side, right? And addressing demand, and reuse and recycling is partly a demand issue. And then also the supply, right? And the exponential increase in production and supply, and then learning about toxicity, learning about the lack of testing around toxicity, learning about the life cycle and how fossil fuel intensive it is just to produce all these different chemical compositions. And so we have a lot to digest. If you were a presenter and you presented slides, or if you have more slides and information, I'm sure the State Impact Center can be a clearinghouse for getting that information out there. We had, again, 20 offices, a number of AGs represented. As you go back to your home jurisdiction, talk to your attorneys general, right? Tell them you went to this conference, tell them what you learned, get them to focus on it, engage them in this conversation, and hopefully collectively we can all take some action here. We're buzzing in Connecticut already about what we can do with what we learned, and that's the whole point of this coming together. So the most important thing is that we finish this on a great, happy, and wonderful note. So we're going to go to Pepe's. Pepe's is one of the majors. It's generally considered that Pepe's, Sally's, and Modern are the three majors. That's subject to some dispute. I guess that's not really science, but so there's some perspective on that. But I think the way I explain it is, the first time you go to Pepe's and you sit down in the restaurant in the OG here in New Haven. There are other Pepe's now, and there are other Sally's, up and down the Eastern Seaboard. But when you go to the original and you sit down on Worcester Street and have a hot Pepe's pie for the first time, it's magic. So we're going to Pepe's for a tasting. Everyone's on your own for transportation, so carpool, get an Uber, get over to Pepe's, and let's enjoy some pizza to cap this conference. Bethany, do you want to say anything just to finish up? Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
If you are.
Thank you so much for all your time and attention. This has been amazing to learn so much in such a short amount of time. We are going to circulate all the materials and a report that we hope you take home and that you use to really keep digesting. All the panelists and speakers, please share any other information that you haven't already shared with us that we should incorporate there. And thank you for your dialogue here today. This was a productive conversation where I think a lot of interesting issues got aired and a lot of information was shared. Thank you, Jasmine and Madeline and Megan, for making this all happen. They probably already went downstairs. They're ready to help you all get to the pizza. So let me not stand in the way. Thank you, everybody.